subscribe and click the bell icon to turn on notifications.
We've made the files the instructor uses in this tutorial available for free. Just click the link below in the video details to get these.
Hello everyone and welcome to Access 2021 Advanced. My name is Deborah Ashby and I'm a Microsoft trainer and I'm going to be your host for this course. Now I've been using Access for over 20 years now, and in that time I've helped thousands of students set up, create and manage very simple to quite complex and sophisticated databases and applications using Access. And Access 2021 is the latest standalone version to be released by Microsoft. It allows us to store large amounts of data in an organized and efficient manner and create tables, forms, queries, reports, and macros to interrogate and manage that data. All of that within an easy-to-use interface that is very reminiscent of other popular Microsoft applications that you might have used, like Word and Excel. Now, if you're coming to this course from an older version of Access, then it is worth noting some of the differences between Access 2021 and previous versions. So I would highly recommend jumping on to the Microsoft website and having a read through the What's New in Access 2021 page. And some of my favourite updates are the ability to add tables with fewer clicks, tabs, and also improvements to the relationships window. Despite these changes, if you are coming to this course from an older version, there isn't anything radically different. In fact, you could use this course if you're using Access 2019 without any issue. Now, in the next lesson, we'll talk through some of the specifics of this course, and I'll show you where to locate the course and exercise files, and also give you a few tips about how to set yourself up for success before you begin. I'm really excited to be your host for this course and go on this learning journey with you. That's it for now. I will see you over in the next lesson. Before we dive headfirst into this Access Advanced course, there's a few things that I want to mention just so you are prepared and you can set yourself up for success. Now, the first thing I want you to check is that you've downloaded all of the course resources. So when I say course resources, I'm talking about the course files and the exercise files. So you'll find within this course a lesson that will allow you to do that. And those are both zip files that contain all of the files that I use as we go through these videos, plus all of the files that you need to complete the exercises at the end of the sections. Now, I have all my course files in File Explorer. As I said, you're going to get yours from a link in this course. But what you'll find is that I've basically created a brand new file for each lesson that you work through. Now, you don't necessarily have to do that. This course flows through from the beginning. So the first course file that you download in section 2, for example, when, for example, we're working on the Northwind database, this is the first file for Northwind. And the idea of this course is that you work through each of these lessons, just building up your Northwind database. So you don't necessarily have to keep reopening every file that I have here. I've got them there in case you get lost at any point and you need to just catch up. You can jump to whichever file I'm using at any given time. But the idea is that you open the first file and you go through each lesson on that file until I tell you that we're switching to a different database or a different file. So I'll leave it up to you to decide how you want to work through those, but all of the files are in here. You shouldn't have any problems. You'll also see that I've included things like code that you need, for example, SQL code that I refer to in the lessons. If I refer to any images, you'll find those in there as well. And these are all there to help you. If you want to use your own images, that's not a problem. You don't have to do everything exactly the same way that I'm doing it. So just be aware of that and make sure that you have both the course files and the exercise files downloaded. Another thing I'd like you to check is if you open up Access and open up any file and go into File and into Options, I want you to go to the General tab and I want you to check your default database folder. So this is basically where all of your files are going to save. So make sure that you choose a location for all of your database files that is suitable for you. And if you come across any course files or exercise files in the folder that have a password to open them, then this is the password that you're going to need. So make sure that you've made a note of that so that you can just type it in to open those files. That is pretty much it. Not too much when it comes to setup. Let's dive into the first lesson. In the first lesson of the second section, we're going to take a look at primary keys and indexing rules and guidelines. And we're going to continue working on the Night Movies database from the beginner's course. Now, if you haven't sat or been through the beginner's course, and this is the first time that you're seeing this, you'll find all of the files that I'm working with in the course files folder so you can follow along. And basically what we have here is the basic structure for a movie rental database. And we've got to a certain point in the development of this database. Now what we're going to do here is we're going to take a closer look at primary keys, indexes, and indexing rules and guidelines. Now the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to pull up the navigation pane because currently we have that hidden from view. Now a quick way to do that is simply to press the F11 key on your keyboard, and that's going to open up that pane on the left hand side so we can now see all of the tables that make up this database, all of the queries, all of the forms, reports and macros. And we're really going to focus in on the actor table in this particular lesson. So let's double click on Table Actor to open it up. Now you can see here we have roughly 8 columns of information. We have the ID field, the full actor name, given names, family name, gender, birth country, born date, and died date if applicable. Now the ID field that you see in that first column is the primary key field for this table. How do we know that? Well, if we switch into Design View, and before I do that, I'm going to close down the navigation form. If we right click and go into Design View, you can see that we have that little key icon next to the ID field. Also, if we take a look up on the table design ribbon in the tools group, we can see that primary key is highlighted. So this table has one primary key field and it's the ID field. Now, what does the ID field do in a table? Well, it uniquely identifies the record in a table. Now, technically, you don't have to have a primary key, but almost all tables you'll come across do have one. And in this actor table, the number that you see in here, whilst it uniquely identifies the record, it doesn't really have too much of a relationship with the actual actor name. Now, if we jump back into Design View and make sure that we have that ID field selected, if you take a look at the field properties at the bottom, you can see that this field is indexed. Now, the primary key field isn't the only field in this table that's indexed. Let's click on actor name. Is this one indexed? Yes, it is. No duplicates. Given names? No, that field isn't indexed. Family name is, gender is, birth country is, born date isn't, and died date isn't. So about half of these fields that we have in this table are indexed. Now, I would hope that if you are coming to this advanced course, having already sat the beginner's course, then you're going to understand what indexing is. But just in case, let's take a moment to look at the purpose of indexes. Now, as I mentioned, the ID values that you see in that first column have no relation to the actual actors themselves. Those numbers are automatically assigned when we add records to the table. So as actors are added, they are added at the end of the table and they're given the next number. So if we delete somebody from the table, the ID does not become available to someone else. For example, if I was to delete record number 3, Leonardo DiCaprio, and then add somebody new to the bottom of the table, they won't be given the ID of 3, because these IDs are always unique even after you've deleted a record. Now, something that's very common and something you might want to do in this table is maybe we want to search for an actor, let's say Henry Fonda. And let's pretend for a second that the only field that we have indexed in this table is the ID field. So without any other indexes available, the only way that Access can find Henry Fonda is to start at the top of the table and check to see if each record is Henry Fonda until it gets all the way down to row 17, where we actually have Henry Fonda. So that's quite a process-intensive task. Now we have a reasonably small data set just here, but imagine if you had hundreds of thousands of rows. Without indexing on the actor name field, your search is going to be a lot slower because it has to go through every single row of the table, checking to see if it's the actor that you're looking for. Now what indexing does is it just makes this process a lot quicker. What we could do here is make the actor's whole name an index field. So if we right click and go back into Design View, actor name just here, this is where you would come to change that. So mine's set to yes already, duplicates okay. So this field is indexed. So what it basically means is that if someone searches, Access will maintain a lookup index and it will go straight to Henry Fonda and it will return the record. So indexes basically allow the search to go directly to the record without searching through other records. Now that's all good in theory, however, not all queries are this simple. Now, maybe we want to run another search, but we want to search for all actors born in the USA before 1930, whose first name is Henry. So again, you might imagine searching through all of the records. Now, imagine if we had 100,000 records, that could take some time. But if we have an index on birth country, that would certainly help. And if we had an index on given name, we could go to all of the Henrys, and that would give us a subset to begin with. So if those were the kinds of searches that people were doing on my database, I would definitely make sure that things like the birth country are indexed and also things like the given name. So currently I have mine set to no. Let's double click and change it to yes. Now that's fine, but remember with each new index there is an increased load when it comes to maintenance. That means whenever data is changed, maybe actors are added to the database or if the records are modified, then the indexes need to be maintained as well. And we find that the cost of improved querying is deterioration in the performance of updates. So how you achieve this balance is entirely up to you and how you work. If it's more important to have slick updates or slick queries, that will depend on the nature of the database and the use. So if you have a database where the data is fairly stable, but there are many people querying the database, then it's going to be more important for you to have fast queries. However, if we have lots of updates going on in the database, maybe we're constantly adding or removing things, and not many people are running queries, then the opposite is true. And there are some basic rules and guidelines surrounding things like primary keys and indexing. Now, one thing you need to remember is that the primary key is always indexed, and we can have up to 32 indexed fields. Now, there are certain types of fields that you can't index. For example, you can't index a long text field. So if you have a field in a table that maybe houses a description of a product, the description is normally quite a long field, and in general, people wouldn't be searching your database based off of the description. They're more likely to search on something like the product ID or the product name. So not all fields can be indexed. Now, where you have a field that has a limited number of values, so maybe something like gender, generally speaking, indexing gender will not really help when it comes to query performance. However, in more modern databases in 2023, where more genders are recognized, then you may well need to introduce a gender index. So which fields you index is entirely up to you, but it's good to bear in mind these little guidelines. Now, if we take a look back at our table, I'm just going to select the birth country field. You can see here that this is indexed and it says duplicates okay. Now, clearly with something like country, duplicates will occur because we could have multiple actors born in the same country. So in this case, duplicates would be okay. The same applies to something like given names. We could theoretically have actors with the same given names. Now, all of these decisions that you make about your indexing are not final. You can always change them later on. So if something isn't working for you, you can go back in and you can add or remove an index later on. And if you haven't really used indexes before, you might just want to remove the index from the gender field in the table to get yourself familiar. So if we take a look at gender just here, you can see that currently this is indexed. And as I mentioned, Because this is a limited field, I wouldn't necessarily index this. So just to have a little practice, you might want to not index this field and save the table. Once you've done that, I will see you in the next lesson where we're going to speak a little bit more about primary keys and indexing. In this lesson, we're going to talk a little bit more about indexes and some of the specific features of indexes. We're going to talk about composite indexes, auto-indexing, and also the effect of compact and repair. So we're working back in our Night Movies database. I'm going to press F11 to open up our navigation pane because we want to open up Tubble Actor one more time. And I'm going to close down the navigation form and let's jump into Design View. Now, if we take a look at our fields here, actor name is an indexed field. We can see that in our field properties. It says indexed, yes, no duplicates. So if I wanted to search for an actor by their full name, for example, Henry Fonda, I could do that. However, there is an alternative to this approach. Now, the actor name in this particular table is made up of two other fields, given name and family name. So let's switch back to Datasheet view so we can see this a bit more clearly. We have a column that has the full actor name, but we also have two other columns which shows the given name, that's the first name, and another column for family name. So what we could do here is treat given name as an indexed field, family name as an index field, and the two together as a composite index field. Because then, if we search for Henry Fonda, instead of searching the actor name field, what Access will do is look up an index that has two parts. The first part is Henry, the second part is Fonda. And this in general is going to be more efficient for your database. So how do we set this up? Well, what we can do is we can go to the Table Design tab and notice in the Show Hide group we have an Indexes button. So let's click this because this is going to show us the indexes that exist within this current table. So you can see those are all the fields that are indexed. Now, as I mentioned previously, in general, I wouldn't index the gender field. And this might be something that you changed in the previous lesson because I did tell you just to practice that. But if you didn't, let's just delete out gender from our index. So what I'm going to do from here is I'm going to create my composite index and I'm going to call it first last. The first field is going to be the given name and the sort order is ascending. And then the next field name is going to be the family name. I don't need to actually add the index name again just here because Access will recognize that there's a blank there and know that this is a composite index that we're creating. Now I could carry on going. I could have up to 10 fields as part of my composite index. We're just going to have the two. Now, another important thing to note here is that the given name field doesn't need its own index. If we were to just search on given name, Access would use this composite index, but only the first part of it. Whereas with the family name, we would need to leave the index for family name because it doesn't search that part of the composite index. So just a little FYI there. So let's close this indexes dialog box and our composite index has been created. Now I'm going to jump back into indexes because I want to take a closer look at this primary key field. Now, as we've already mentioned, primary key values must be unique, but a primary key can actually be a composite index. Now, if that's the case, although the key overall must be unique, the individual component field values might not be unique. However, no field used in the primary key can have a null value. So if we just select family name just here and take a look at the index properties, you can see it says primary, no, unique, no, ignore nulls, no. So when Access is building its index, what happens if the family name is null? Well, if ignore nulls is set to no, as it is here, then there is still an entry placed in the index for the family name, but for the index value, there is null. And we might well expect that in a large table with an index where ignore nulls is set to no, you might have a number of records where this particular index has a null value. Now, if you say ignore nulls is yes, then any records where there is a null value will not have an entry in that index. Now, generally speaking, the default is Ignore nulls no. But if you do want to exclude null values from an index, then you want to set this to yes. Now note, for a composite index, the index value will only be null if every individual field value is null as well. So if any of the individual field values are not null, then the composite index value will not be null as well. So just a couple of points to bear in mind there. The next thing I want to speak to you about is auto-indexing. Now suppose we want to add a new field to this table, and I'm just going to call it test, and we'll leave it on short text. Now note, down in the properties area, the default where it says indexed is set to no for this field. Let's add another field into this table, but this time I'm going to call it num underscore test. Notice the difference. If we take a look down in the field properties area, it says indexed yes. What about if I add test underscore ID? That is also set to indexed yes. So what is the difference between this first one, where we just have test, and these other two? Well, this relates to a little setting in Access Options. So let's jump up to File and go down to Options, and we want to go to the Object Designer page. Now in this first section here, Table Design View, this is the option that we're looking for, Auto Index on Import Create. And you can see we have some items in here, ID, key, code, and num, separated by semicolons. So if you create a table where the name of the field begins or ends with any of those four, the field is going to be auto-indexed. Now, of course, you could change this. For example, I could remove num from here, and therefore anything that starts or ends with the word num is not going to be auto-indexed. I could replace this with something else if I wanted specific fields to be auto-indexed, and then make sure I use that keyword in the name of my field. So you can modify this, but in general, these are the default items. Now I'm just going to cancel on here because I don't really want to make any changes to that field, and then we're just going to delete these rows that we added into the table. Now the final thing I'd like to speak to you about in this particular lesson is compact and repair and the effect that that can have on your database. Now, as part of your maintenance schedule, you should be running compact and repair regularly on your database. And this is especially important where you have a lot of indexes. Because what compact and repair does is it basically goes through and it tidies up all of the tables in your database and rebuilds all of those indexes. So this is really good if you find that your database is getting a bit sluggish, or maybe the performance is poor. Running a compact and repair is really going to help. It's going to make your database run a lot more efficiently, and it's something that I strongly recommend that you do on a regular basis. Now, we did cover compact and repair in the beginner's course, but just as a quick reminder, because it's so simple, if we jump up to File and go into Info, this is where you have the compact and repair option. I highly recommend implementing a regular schedule just to run this, to fix any existing problems, and also to prevent problems further down the line. In this section of the course, we're going to delve a little bit deeper into Datasheet View. Now, hopefully by this point you are familiar with what Datasheet View is, but we're going to concentrate on some of the more advanced features that you might not be familiar with. Now, to do this, we're going to be using a different sample database. And we're going to use the sample database that's provided by Microsoft, the Northwind database. So in this lesson, I'm just going to show you how to set this database up so that we're prepared for the next few lessons. Now, it might be that you already have this database. As I said, it is a really common sample database that a lot of people have and a lot of people use. So if you do already have the Northwind database set up on your PC, then you can skip this lesson and move on to the next one. However, if you don't have it, then just stick with me because I'm going to show you how you can very quickly create it. Now, in older versions of Access, the process of creating the Northwind database was a little bit more lengthy. We had to go away, we had to download a file, and then there was a certain amount of setup that we needed to do. Fortunately, in the later versions like Access 2021, this process is a lot simpler. So let's walk through it. All we need to do here is we need to jump up to the File tab, go down to New, and it's actually a template that we can search for. So all we need to do is type in Northwind, hit enter, and there it is just there. So this is effectively a template. Let's click on it. We get a little bit of information about the database. So we can see this is a sample database template that demonstrates how Access can manage small business customers' orders, inventory, purchasing, suppliers, shipping, and employees. And it's provided by the Microsoft Corporation. Now notice here we have a default file name of database1, and then underneath the location where it's going to be saved. Now a problem that I have here is that because I save all of my files into a fairly long path name, Access doesn't tend to like that. So I'm actually going to click on Browse, and for the purpose of demonstration, I'm just going to put it on the desktop just here. Now of course you can save your file to wherever you like. Let's click on the Create button. Access is going to go away and prepare the template for use. And then it pops up this little login dialog box. Now this little login is something that we're going to explore later on in the course. I'm going to show you how you can create this and how you can do things like select specific employees. So for the time being, I'm just going to select anyone from this list. Again, these are all sample users. Don't worry too much about what's going on here at the moment. Let's just log in to the database. And there we go. Now you might find that when you do log into this, you get one of those yellow security warnings running across the top. I didn't actually get it, but if you do, just remember to click the Enable Content button, because this is coming from Microsoft, so we know that this is a trusted source. So that is pretty much it. That's all I needed you to do in this lesson. We're now ready to go, and in the next lesson, we're going to explain a bit more about the setup of this database. In this lesson, we're going to continue on talking about Datasheet view. And if you recall in the last lesson, we downloaded the Northwind Traders template. Now, something just to note very quickly. If you take a look up in the title bar, you can see that I have 0302 Northwind _A01. Now, this is my naming convention to make it easier for you to find which files I'm working on from the course files folder. So the 0302 relates to the section and the lesson that we're in. Northwind specifies the database that we're using, and A01 really just represents that this is the first file of the database. Now, when you saved your template, you're probably going to have something completely different showing in that title bar. And by default, it will show the entire path name of where you've saved this file. Now, this can look particularly messy, and if you did work your way through the Beginner's Access 2021 course, you'll know how to change this. But in case you didn't, you can make this shorter by jumping up to File, going into your Access options, and underneath Current Database, where it says Application Title, this is where you can change this to a more concise title for your file. Now, I don't mind what you change this to. You can change it to the same as what I'm using if you want to keep things organized, or you can implement your own naming convention. But just be aware that that is why my title probably looks different to yours. Now, in this lesson, we're going to focus on Datasheet view, and specifically 5 different areas. We're going to start out by taking a look at a quick update query, which is really important when it comes to getting your dates in this database to be more meaningful to you. We're then going to take a look at some navigation and keyboard shortcuts. I'm going to show you how you can find records, how you can add and change records, and also how you can delete multiple records. So let's start out by taking a look at this update query. So let's open up the navigation pane by clicking on the arrow, and you can see there is a lot to this database. We have so many different tables. Now I'm going to double click on the orders table, which you're going to find under the supporting objects section. So let's double click to open this up. Now notice in here the order dates. We have order date, ship date, and if we scroll across, we have a column for paid date as well. Now note the dates that are in use in this column. You can see those dates are pretty recent. Now, when I say pretty recent, that means pretty recent to the moment in time now that this video is being recorded. So I'm recording this video at the start of April 2023, so all of these dates aren't too far in the distant past. However, it might be that you're coming to this course maybe next year or a couple of years into the future, and you want to make these dates a little bit more accurate for the moment in time that you're running through this course. Now we have quite a few records in here, and going through and changing all of the dates in all of these columns manually is going to be a bit of a lengthy process. So what you'll find in the course files folder is a little SQL file that you could use to update all of these dates in one go. Alternatively, what you can do is use find and replace. So if I select all of the order date column, go up to the Home tab and into the Find group, we have a replace option. Now what I could do in here is I could say find, if I wanted to change these to 2023, I could say find 2022, replace with 2023, but I'd need to make sure that I have selected the current document and I want to match to any part of the field. And then when I click on replace all, it should replace every occurrence of 2022 with 2023. So you have a couple of different methods there for getting your dates to update so that they're accurate for you. The next thing I'd like to talk about is keyboard shortcuts. Now the easiest way to pull up a big long list of all of the keyboard shortcuts is to jump into the help files and click on the help button, or simply press the F1 key on your keyboard and then do a quick search for keyboard shortcuts in Access. Now remember, with these panes that open up on the right hand side, we can just drag them out to make them a little bit larger. And if we scroll down and take a look at some of these clickable links, you can see that one of them is work in the datasheet view. So this is going to show us keyboard shortcuts that specifically relate to datasheet view. So we have some useful shortcuts when it comes to navigating between fields and records. We have some useful shortcuts for navigating to another screen of data. We have more shortcuts for select and move a column, and then we have shortcuts for working with Subdatasheets. Now we haven't spoken about Subdatasheets as yet. That is coming up a bit later on in this section. But what I would say is that after you've worked your way through that lesson, you might want to come back to this help file and just review some of those useful shortcuts related to Subdatasheets. Now, even if you're somebody who doesn't particularly like using keyboard shortcuts, I would still recommend you have a read through some of these because they can greatly improve your efficiency when you're working, navigating, and moving around your database, particularly in Datasheet view. So have a little review and choose your favorites. Now, the next topic to talk about is finding records. And we did just briefly jump into the find and replace dialog box when we changed the dates in our database. So let's take a look at this in more detail because there are a couple of little important features in here. Now you can determine whether the find begins searching in just the current field or in all fields by your initial selection. Now if I was to put my cursor just in the order ID field just here, Control F, notice it says find what, where I can type in my search criteria, and then it says look in current field, and it's going to match the whole field. So if I was looking for, let's say I was looking for Nancy, let's type that in, click on find next, it's saying that the search item was not found. Now I know I have a number of instances of Nancy in this database, so why isn't it finding it? Now it's because we're only looking in the current field. So I'm clicked in the order ID field, so that's the only field that it's searching in. So it's not going to find Nancy because Nancy is in the employee name field. Now let's cancel out of there. What about if I was to select the entire record and press Control F? This time I can type in Nancy. Notice by default it's going to look in the current document. So it should find it, right? Let's click on Find Next. It still doesn't find it. Why is that? Because we're matching the whole field. Now notice that in the employee column, Nancy has her first name and last name. So if I typed in Nancy Freehafer at the top here and the match was whole field, then it would find her. But because I just have the word Nancy, I would need to say any part of field, find next, and it's going to find the first occurrence of Nancy. So just be aware of what you're selecting in here because you can very easily miss something and your find won't work. And once again, I would recommend that you do refer to the help files when it comes to find, because we can also use wildcard characters when we're searching. And some of these you might be familiar with from other applications. For example, the asterisk in a search matches any number of characters. A question mark matches a single alphabet in a specific position. Square brackets matches characters within the brackets. So let's take a look at a quick example of this one just here, the square brackets. So I'm going to select a record again, Control F, and let's say that this time I want to find Anna or Anne. So what I could do here is I could type ANN, and then in square brackets I could type AE, and that will find either Anna or Anne. We're going to search in the current document, any part of the field, find next, it finds Anne, so on and so forth. Now when it comes to adding, changing and deleting records in Datasheet view, this is really simple. Now a lot of people, when they're adding new records in, they'll go straight to the bottom of the table and they'll just start typing in this new field just here. And that is perfectly fine, but just remember that you do have other options. You can add a new record using our record selection buttons down here, so you can see new blank record. Or we could go up to the Home tab, and in the Records group we have a new button here as well. So if I was to click here and then let's just select Andrew again, as soon as I make a selection, an order ID gets assigned. Now this order ID is an auto-numbered field. So this isn't a field that I can change because these numbers are automatically assigned when we add a new record. This now becomes a valid record in the database that we're editing. And you can see we have a little pencil all the way over in the left-hand column that lets me know that I'm in editing mode. And remember, we can move between our different fields by pressing the Tab key, and we can just go in and add our information. If we want to come out of here, we can press Escape, and it's basically not going to save that record. Now, if we do that again, if I do want to save this record, I can simply press Shift, Enter, and that is going to take me out of editing mode, and this record is now part of the database. If I now wanted to get rid of it, I couldn't press Escape, that's not going to do anything. I would need to delete the record out, which moves us on to the topic of deletions. Again, very simple. Select the record. We can right-click and choose Delete Record. We can go up to the Home tab, and in the Records group we have a delete option just there. Or we can simply press the Delete key on our keyboard. We'll always get a warning, and one important thing to remember here is that you cannot undo deletions. So I'm going to say no because I do want to keep that record. And it works in a similar way. If you want to delete multiple records out, you just need to make a multiple selection. So we're going to select the first one that we want to delete, hold down Shift, select, and we get a block, and then we can use all the same deletion methods. So I could press the Delete key, it's going to ask me to confirm, and I can choose yes or no. So that's a quick reminder of some of the basics of working in Datasheet view. Make sure you're familiar with all of these, and then we can move on to the next lesson. In this lesson, we're going to take a look at how we can customize Datasheet view. Because as we've already mentioned, we might use Datasheet view for data maintenance or querying. So we're going to start out by looking at the ways that you can arrange Datasheet view to make it more convenient to use. And we're mainly going to focus on formatting and reorganizing columns. Now to do this, we're going to be using the orders table in the Northwind traders database. And you can see that's exactly what I have open on the screen right now. If you'd like to follow along with me, you're going to find this file in the course files folder. So now would be a great time to open it. Now let's start out with formatting. When you look at a table in Datasheet view, as we're looking at the orders table here, the formatting that you see is very much dictated by a set of options that you can change in Access Options. So let's jump up to the File tab and open up Options, and then notice that we have a Datasheet page. Now what we can do in here is really customize the way that our Datasheet view looks. For example, currently we're displaying horizontal and vertical grid lines, but what I could do is deselect both of these to turn those off. We also have the default cell effect set to flat, but again we could change this to one of the other two options, raised or sunken. So let's go for raised, just so you can see what this looks like. We have the default column width underneath, and then we can choose our default font that we want to use in Datasheet view. So currently mine is set to size 11. I'm going to change this to size 14. Now when we click on OK, it's going to look like nothing has happened. Now that's simply because we need to close down the orders table by clicking on the cross, And then when we reopen it by double clicking, you can see those changes have taken effect. So we now have, instead of the flat grid lines, we have raised grid lines, and you can see that that font is a lot bigger. And because we changed these options in Access Options, it means that that's been changed universally. So any table we open is going to have these changes applied. For example, if I was to open, let's go for Order Summary, double click to open that table, you can see it looks, or it has the same look and feel as the Orders table. So when you change those options in Access Options, it's a universal change that affects every single table. Now we can also make changes to the look and feel on a table by table basis. So let's jump back to the Orders table. And what I could do here is go up to the Home tab, and then over in the text formatting group, we could change this from Calibri 14 to something completely different. So let's go for something a little bit crazy so it really stands out. I think I'm going to go for Berlin sans FB Demi. Now you can see that change has applied to the orders table, but if I go to Order Summary, it hasn't applied. So that is how you can make changes on a table by table basis. Now we're going to close Order Summary, because something else you might notice is that if you do make any changes, particularly to the size of the font that you're using, you might then need to modify the column width or the row height. Now again, this is something we can apply to all of the columns in the table or individual columns on their own. For example, if we take a look at the employee column, if I were to select this column, right click, notice we have a field width option in here, which is going to allow us to either manually type in the field width, or we can choose best fit, which is basically going to widen out the column to the length of the longest item in that column. Now notice that change has only been applied to the employee column, but of course we can also change all of the columns by selecting all of them just by dragging across. Right click, and then we can go into field width, best fit, and it's going to modify the width of all of the columns. Now when it comes to row height, it works in a slightly different way because the row height must be the same for all fields. So if I was to select one row, right click and go into row height, and let's just choose, I'm going to change this to 25 and hit OK. Notice that it doesn't just change it for that one row, it changes it for all of the rows in the table. Now I'm going to change this back to the standard height, and I'm also going to put the font back to Calibri. Now it's also worth noting that some formatting applies to the whole sheet and some to individual columns. For example, if we take, let's scroll across and use the Ship City column as an example. If I select this column and just go up to text formatting and change it to bold, notice again that this is one of those selections that changes everything in the datasheet. However, with this same column selected, let's align this to the center. So again, from the text formatting area, I'm just going to center align, but notice that that only applies to the column that we have selected. So there's no real rhyme or reason here, but it is definitely something that you need to be aware of. Now, the final thing I want to speak to you about in this particular lesson is simply reorganizing the columns. Now, by default, the order that these columns appear in are going to be very much dictated by the order that you have in Design View. So you can see this is the current order, and that's reflected when we go into Datasheet View. Now, it might be that you're working on maybe 2 or 3 of these columns. For example, if I was maybe working on the employee column, but I was also working on a column that was all the way over here, maybe shipping fee, it can get quite tedious having to scroll back and forth constantly. So if you are doing maintenance and doing this kind of thing, then it can be useful sometimes to reorder the columns so that they're next to each other, which definitely makes your life a lot easier. So again, let's use the Ship City as our example. Maybe I want to move this over here in between employee and customer. And it's really simple to move fields. We can simply click on them, and notice as I drag, we get that black bar that shows me where it's going to be when I let go of the mouse. So when I let go, we've moved that field. Now it's worth noting that now Ship City is the third field in the table. If we were to jump back into Design View, you can see that it doesn't actually reorder it in here. Any changes you make in Datasheet view to the order of the columns are just temporary changes. They don't really affect anything else in the table. And of course, we can apply this same method if we want to move multiple columns. So I would just simply need to select all the columns I want to move, and then I can simply drag them and drop them to move those columns across. So really nice and straightforward. Now another thing we can do is we can hide columns. So again, let's use Ship City. We can right click and we can choose to hide fields, and that temporarily hides that field from view. Again, it doesn't delete it from the table, it's still there. But hiding fields that you don't necessarily need to work on, again, can be really useful so that you can just focus in on the columns that you're interested in. The only thing is you have to remember to unhide them after you've finished. Now, when it comes to unhiding, if we right click and go to unhide fields, we're going to get this little pop-up box. And you can see all of the columns that we've hidden don't have a tick in them. So we're basically not displaying them. So if I put a tick in Ship City, you can see immediately that's pulled back into the table. And the final tip that can be really useful when you're working in Datasheet view is the ability to freeze fields. And this is very similar to the freeze panes option in Excel. So once again, if you have a table that has lots of columns, so much so that you have to scroll across in order to see them all, what you could do is maybe freeze order ID and employee to make your life a bit easier. So if I select both of these columns, right click and go to freeze fields, now when I scroll, those fields are going to stay there, but it allows me to scroll across all of the others. So that can be a really useful little option. And of course, to reverse that, we can right click and unfreeze all fields to put everything back to how it was. So those are a few tips when it comes to customizing Datasheet view. In the next lesson, we're going to take a look in more detail at advanced sorting and filtering techniques. In this lesson, we're going to take a look at some of the advanced sorting and filtering options that we have when we're working in Datasheet view. Now, sorting on any of the fields is easy enough. For example, if we wanted to sort by customer, we could select the column, right click, and right at the top here, we can sort A to Z or Z to A. So really nice and straightforward. But one thing to note here is that the options that you see in that right click menu are really determined by the type of data that you have in the column. So when we're sorting something like customer column, because that contains text, we can sort A to Z or Z to A. Whereas if we were to go across to something like the order date column and do the same thing, right click, because we have dates in here, we get the options of sorting oldest to newest or newest to oldest. So just be aware of that when you're using your sort options. Now, when we do a sort in this way, it's going to sort by one column only. So if I sort A to Z, it's going to organize all of the customers alphabetically, but we're only sorting on one column. Now we can also sort on multiple columns by going up to the Home tab, and in the Sort and Filter group, and just a side note, we have ascending and descending in here as well, but we also have this advanced area. So if we click the drop down, we can go into Advanced Filter Sort, and this is going to jump us across to our diagram view. And if you worked your way through our beginner's course, then this will probably look really familiar to you. It's showing us the table, and then underneath we have this little grid, which is going to allow us to build different kinds of sorts. So what I could do is drag any of these fields. For example, I could drag customer ID down into the fields area, and then I can choose how I want to sort in ascending or descending. And if I wanted to sort on multiple columns, I would just carry on going. So maybe I want to sort by customer ID and order date. I can drag that field down here and then choose if I want to sort in ascending or descending. So I could carry on going, building up my sort just here. And this is a very customized sort to make sure that I'm sorting on multiple fields. Now I'm going to remove both of these because we are going to talk more about this later on. Now, another way that we can sort on multiple fields is by ensuring that they are in the correct order from left to right in the table. So if we close down this view and just go back to our orders table, and maybe I want to sort on ship via and then ship city. So I need to select both of these fields, but currently if I select ship via and then hold down Control, that doesn't work. What about if I hold down Shift? That's going to select all of those columns in between. So what I would need to do here is if I want to sort on both of these, I could drag ship city next to ship via. That makes it very easy for me to select both fields, and then I can right click and I can choose sort A to Z, for example. So notice we have our blanks at the top. Let's just ignore those for the time being. But now we should have this in alphabetical order. So we have all of the shipping company A's. But if you take a look in the ship city, this is also in alphabetical order. We have Chicago, New York, Salt Lake City, so on and so forth. So we've done a multiple sort just by selecting both of those columns, but the columns need to be next to each other. Now, if you decide that you don't like this sort and you want to just take everything back to how it was, and this is something that I do all the time, I just want to get rid of all of the sorting that I've done, we do have on the home ribbon in the sort and filter group a remove sort option. When we click this, it's going to put everything back to how it was originally. So those are some of your more advanced sorting options. As I said, we are going to take a more detailed look at these a bit later on in the course. But for now, let's move on to the options that we have when it comes to advanced filtering of our data. Now, filtering just allows us to filter out data we're not currently interested in. It doesn't delete it. We can always bring it back again. Now, hopefully by now, most of us are used to how filters work. But let's say, for example, we wanted to filter on ship name. We could click the drop-down arrow that you see in the heading here. We could choose a text filter, or we could be more specific and just select all of the items that we want to include in the filter using the checkboxes below. Now, another thing that applies to filtering is if you look down in the records areas, this little bar running across the bottom underneath the data, notice we have a little filter button here that currently says no filter and it's grayed out. And this actually acts as a toggle. And as an alternative to the filter that I've just shown you, we can select the value that we want to filter on before we apply the filter. So if I were to click in, let's click in the ship name column where it says Christina Lee. If I now go up to the sort and filter group where we have selection, you can see that this is now contextual to where I'm clicked, the field that I have selected. So I can now quickly run a filter for all records that are equal to Christina Lee. So if I click this, it's going to apply that filter, and now I only have the records where the ship name is Christina Lee. Now notice that now I've applied that filter. If you take a look down in that record selector area, it now says that this list is filtered. Also notice in the sort and filter group, we have toggle filter selected up here. Now this toggle filter is basically the same as what we have down here in the record selector. So what we can do is we can click either one of these. I'm going to use the one at the bottom to toggle between how it was previously or rerun that same filter. So this can be really helpful if you want to quickly get back to your filtered information or rerun that same filter. So I'm going to rerun the filter, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to change ship via. I'm going to apply a second filter by clicking the drop down because I only want to see shipping company C. Let's click on OK. So now we have what we call a composite filter because we're using two different fields to filter on. And this time, let's use the toggle filter button. If I toggle the filter, it's going to put everything back. If I toggle it again, it's going to run both of those filters. Now, something else that we have, if we click on advanced, we can filter by form. And this really allows us to build our own comprehensive filter. So you can see here, it's already filled in the last criteria that I've got applied. So shipping company C and Christina Lee, but I could go through and start adding in other pieces of filter criteria. So you can complete these different fields and really build up your own customized filter. So that can be really useful as well. And as I said, we're going to delve into this in a bit more detail a bit later on in the course. Now I'm just going to remove both of these filters, and I can do that by simply highlighting and pressing delete. Let's toggle the filter and we're back to how we were. Now the final thing I want to show you in this particular lesson is how we can add total rows to our tables. So if we scroll down to the bottom, it might be that I want to have a total row so that I can see the total amount for the shipping fee column. Now, a lot of these columns aren't really relevant to totals. I wouldn't want to add up the customers or add up the order dates. But there are other things you can do in here aside from sums. So again, if we go up to the Home tab into the Records group, we have a little Totals button just here. So if we click Totals, we get our total row at the bottom, and then I can scroll across to where we have something that makes a bit more sense, for example, shipping fee. If I click in here and then click the drop down, I can choose the calculation that I want to use. So maybe here I want to use a sum, but maybe if I go back to order date, maybe I want to find what the earliest order date was. So I could use this to find the minimum order date. So this can be useful for performing calculations on your data. In this lesson, we're going to take a look at Subdatasheets. Because when we're working in Datasheet view, and in particularly if you need to update data, it seems as if you are restricted to working on one table at a time. But in fact, it is possible to show more than one table in Datasheet view, and specifically to show tables that are linked together. So in this lesson, we're going to take a look at Subdatasheets. I'm going to show you how you can add a subdatasheet, remove or hide a subdatasheet, how you can open and close subdatasheets, and how you can add and update data in Datasheet view using subsheets. Now we're going to be using the Esprit de Tour database, and this is version 21 that we're using. And if you worked through the beginner's course, then this is a database that's going to be really familiar to you. If you didn't, and you're coming to this course with fresh eyes, what we basically have here is a database that houses information about different trips. And if you take a look over in the navigation pane, you can see that this particular database contains quite a few different tables. So let's start out by taking a look at how those tables are related in the backend. So if we jump across to Database Tools, in the Relationships group, we're going to click on Relationships to open this up. And you can see all of the tables that we have and how they're all linked together. So this table here, Table Trip, if we expand this down, this is our main table. Or if you want to use Access terminology, this is our fact table. And you can see that this table is linked to other tables, or what we call dimension tables. Now, if we take the top one, for example, if I double click on this link, we can see exactly how those tables are linked together. So we can see that in Table Trip, the ID field is linked to the trip ID field in the table Table Trip Type. If we double click on the next one, we can see that the ID field in the Table Trip table is linked to the trip ID field in Table Trip Country. And if we click on any of these, we can see which fields in the fact table are linked to which fields in the dimension tables. And notice we have this little 1 at the beginning here, and then this little infinity symbol at the end. And this means that we have a one-to-many link between these two tables. So if we open up this particular link, we can see relationship type one-to-many, and that basically means that one trip could have many different tours. And a tour is just simply an instance of a trip. For example, if we have a trip that goes to Italy, that trip might run every single week, and each one of those instances would be classified as a tour. So each trip can have many tours. And this is the relationship that we're interested in this particular lesson, the trip to tour relationship. Now let's close this down and just jump back to the trip table. Now currently none of the trips that you can see in here have sub datasheets. How do I know that? Well, if a trip has a sub datasheet attached, we can see a little plus symbol next to it. Now you might be thinking, okay, that's fine, but what exactly is a sub datasheet? Well, we can add a sub datasheet into the records in our table to display some additional information. For example, maybe I want to be able to see in this view all of the tours for each of these trips. I could do that by adding a sub datasheet. So let's add one. I'm going to select Iconic Italy. I'm going to go to the Home tab into the Records group, and where we have more, notice we have a sub datasheet option, and the only option I have to select here is Insert Sub Datasheet. So let's select it. And I now get to choose the information that I want to display in the sub datasheet. Now I want to display the tour information, and you can see here I get a list of all of the other tables that are in my database. So I'm going to select Table Tour, and you can see below the relationship between these tables reflected. So the code field in Tibble trip is linked to the trip code field in Tibble tour. Let's click on OK. Now notice as soon as I do that, I now get those little plus symbols next to each of these trips. So if I click the plus next to Iconic Italy, it's now showing me all of the tours for Iconic Italy. I can now basically expand any of the trips that I'm interested in seeing that information for. So this can give you a slightly more sophisticated structure. Now it is worth noting that you can't add more than one table. For example, I couldn't add Tibble tour and also Tibble type. We are restricted to just adding one. Now, when it comes to removing sub-datasheets, we go about this in a reasonably similar way. We need to select one of the records, go up to More, into Subdatasheet, and now you can see we have a remove option just here. So let's click Remove. And now if I click the plus next to any of these, it's going to ask me to select a table again in order to put those sub-datasheets back again. Also notice from this More drop down, we have Expand All and Collapse All. So if I wanted to just quickly expand all of these little pluses, I can choose Expand All and I can now see everything. And we can do exactly the opposite by collapsing all as well. Now we can do this in another way. For example, currently I am displaying the sub-datasheet, but if I wanted to remove it, I could change it in the Properties area. Now to access properties, we need to actually switch into Design View, and then we can open up the property sheet. Now notice in the property sheet, we have a field that says Subdatasheet name. And currently that's showing me Tibble tour. That's the datasheet we currently have linked. But if I wanted to remove the datasheets, I could click the drop down, change it to none, and close this down. And then when we go back to Datasheet View, yes, I want to save the table. Notice the pluses are still there, but when I try to expand, it's going to ask me to select a table again. So it's got rid of those sub-datasheets. Now I'm going to turn datasheets back on. So let's use the method that we just looked at. Let's right click, go into Design View, open up the property sheet, and I'm just going to select Tibble tour from here. So we should find that when we jump back into Datasheet View, we can now expand and see that information. Now, one of the reasons for using sub-datasheets is data maintenance. So let's say, for example, we need to make a change to the price of the Iconic Italy trip. And you can see here by some of these tour dates that this is a tour that was run a few years ago. That doesn't really matter too much for what we're trying to do here. But if I do need to make a change, so if the price is going to increase, maybe at the beginning of June 2017, I can do that from the sub-datasheet. So I can click on the calendar icon, or I can simply type in. So let's say from June the 1st, 2017, we'll say the price is going to increase. And we'll just set this to 2,800. Now notice that the price for children is 0 for all of these tours. And that's because this is an adults only trip, so we don't have any prices for children. And when we make a change to the sub-datasheet in this way, it changes in the original table as well. So this sub-datasheet is a representation of the tour table. So if we double click to open up Tibble tour and scroll down to ITI, which is the Iconic Italy trip, if we take a look, we can see that there is the entry that we just added in the sub-datasheet. So people can certainly update data here in Datasheet View. And the final point to mention here is that by default, the column headings or the fields that you see in the sub-datasheet reflect the structure of the original table that they came from. It's time now to do our first exercise of the course. And this exercise is not quite as easy as it might first seem. But if you are pretty good with queries, then you should be able to figure it out. So what I'd like you to do is add a sub-datasheet to the genre table, so that if we were to expand any of these, and I'm going to go for biopic, it's going to look something like that. Note that we only have the title for each of the movies that are part of that genre. And that is all I need you to do in this exercise. As I said, it seems fairly simple and straightforward. But just to give you a little clue, you are going to need to create a query in order to do this. Give it a go, and I will see you in the next section.
For the next section, you'll want to download the course exercise files. Click the link below in the video description to get these. You can also scroll through the details to find timestamps for each section in this course. If you're enjoying this training, please leave us a comment.
In this section of the course, we're going to be taking a look at how we can link tables to other Access databases. So we're going to start out by just discussing the background of this. We're going to take a look at importing and linking. I'm going to show you how to create relationships between linked tables, how you can use the linked table manager, and also how you can remove a link. So let's start by discussing the background of this. Now, as most of us already know, Access has been around for a very long time. And back in the day, it used to be based on a single file, and it was very much a desktop-based system. So one file would contain all of the tables, all of the queries, all of the reports, etc. But as time went on, this restriction became more and more difficult to manage as more people started to use the file. Giving them all access to one file and keeping all of the changes in step has become a lot more important. Now, another factor to consider. As Access databases became more significant, they very often housed data that was useful to other databases, other applications. So it became more important to be able to access data from other databases. Now let's take a look at our Northwind Traders database as a quick example. Now this database contains all of the information about invoices and purchase orders, various forms and reports, but it also contains information about customers. And customer information is widely used data in business. So to demonstrate linking other tables, we're going to create a tiny demo database. See it as the early stages of some kind of CRM system. And in doing that, I'm going to access the customer information from the Northwind database. So let's open up the customers table. Now notice here that each customer has a unique ID. And the customer in this particular example is actually a company. So what we're going to do first is create ourselves a new database. Remember, this database is going to be very, very small. So let's close down Northwind Traders. And we're simply going to create a new blank database. So let's give our database a name, and I'm going to add CRM to the name of this particular database just so we can identify it easily. And I'm going to save it into the course files folder. Let's click on create. So there is my file. It just has one table in it, table 1. Let's right click and jump into design view. And we're going to give this table a name. Let's call it table customer contact and click on OK. So now I can start to go through and add in my fields. And as I said, these fields are going to be related to the types of interaction that I have with my customers. Now by this stage, you should know how to add fields into a table. So I'm going to do that off camera. Join me back here in a couple of moments. So there are my fields. We have an ID field, which is going to be auto-numbered as we add more records. Our customer ID is going to be a number. Our contact type is going to be short text. Contact date is date and time. And then we have some notes. Now this isn't a required field. Remember, it's a long text field, so it's also not indexed, but we're going to have a field for notes in case we need to add any. So each customer record in this table is going to have a unique ID. And that customer ID must correspond to an existing customer. Now at the moment we have no customer details, but we're going to access the customer IDs from the Northwind Traders database. So we're effectively going to create a link here. And we're simply going to focus on the customer ID field. Now, given that we need to access data in another database, we're going to just close down our customer contact table. We're going to jump up to the external data tab, and this is the group we want, import and link. So if we select new data source from database, we can link to another table in a different Access database. So let's choose this option. Now the first thing we need to do here is just browse for the database where the table that we want to link to is located. Now I have mine saved off into the course files folder. You might have yours saved in a different location, so just browse to wherever makes sense for you. Now, one thing to note at this stage is that if you were to move this database into a different folder, it is going to cause problems. And I am going to talk through that problem towards the end of this lesson. So now we've selected where our file is, we have two options. And this is where we specify how and where we want to store the data in the current database. So do we want to import tables, queries, forms, reports, macros, and modules into the current database? So importing them is going to move those tables into this database. Do we want to do that, or do we just want to link to the data source by creating a linked table? Now, if we choose link, which is the option that we want in this scenario, Access will create a table that will maintain a link to the source data. And that's exactly what we want, because we're linking to the Northwind traders database. And there might be a whole bunch of people who constantly make updates to the particular table that we're linking to at Northwind traders. So I don't want to have to re-import a copy of the table every single time somebody makes a change. I want it to update automatically. And if we choose to link, that's exactly what's going to happen. So this is the option that we want. Let's click on OK. And now we can choose which table in the Northwind traders database we want to link to. So these are basically all of the tables from Northwind. So we want to link to the customers table. So we need to select that and click on OK. And notice what's happened here. If you take a look over in the navigation pane, we now have our original table, but we also have the customers table. Now notice it does look slightly different from the one above in the fact that we have a little blue arrow at the side. And that really just lets us know visually that this is a linked table. Now, before we go on any further, just a couple of important points to mention. Being able to do this in this way will very much depend on the security on the Northwind traders database. So it might be that when you try to do this, you just don't have the correct level of access. A second point worth mentioning is that I sometimes rename these linked tables to remind me where the table is coming from. So instead of just customers, if I right click and go to rename, I want to make sure that I know that this is coming from Northwind traders. So I'm going to add NWT underscore on the front there. Now that doesn't change the name of the table in the original location or anything like that. It is purely for your reference. So let's open up this table, double click, and we're going to jump straight into design view. Now notice straight away we get a warning message. It's basically telling me that this is a linked table whose design cannot be modified. So we can only modify the design of a table in the source database. But notice that we can open it anyway, regardless of that fact. So let's say yes to open anyway, and we can now see all of the fields within this table. Now let's select one of these fields. If I select the company field, for example, one thing to notice is in the bottom right-hand corner, can you see it says this property cannot be modified in linked tables. So how much we can change in a linked table is very limited. Now let's close this table down and let's go in and take a look at the relationships in the background. So if we jump up to Database Tools and open up Relationships, I'm going to add both tables. Now notice over in the Add Tables window on the right hand side, one table is underneath links and the other table is underneath tables. And that's really just differentiated because one isn't native to the database that we're creating. So let's add both tables. I'm going to say add selected table, add selected table. Now currently these tables are not linked in any way. So we need to create a relationship between the two tables. Now in the Northwind Traders Customers table, the ID field is basically the customer ID field that we have in Tubble Customer Contact. So let's drag ID and link it to Customer ID. Notice that this is a one-to-many relationship. But another interesting thing to note here is that when you're dealing with linked tables, you can't enforce referential integrity. So just be aware of that. Let's click on Create. And we've now linked those two tables together. Now, the final thing I want to talk to you about in this particular lesson is the Linked Table Manager. So let's jump across to the External Data tab. And in the Import and Link group, notice we have an option for Linked Table Manager. And this is going to basically show you any tables that you have linked. Now what we can do in this window is we can select our linked table, and when we click on refresh, that's going to refresh that link to make sure that that link is still valid. If we don't get any error messages, then we're all good. We can carry on with what we're doing. Now, if you click on the refresh button and you get an error message, it might be because the database that you're linking to has been moved to a different location. And I did mention this briefly towards the beginning of this lesson. So I'm going to go away and I'm just going to move the Northwind Traders database to a different folder in File Explorer. Then we'll refresh the link so we can see what happens. So I've moved this database just to my desktop, so it's no longer in this folder. If I now select it and click on refresh, I'm going to get a message. It cannot find the file. Also, if I close down the link table manager and also close down this relationships window and try to open NWT customers again, I'm going to get the same message. But what we can do is use the linked table manager to relink this file. Notice we have a relink option. Let's click it and we can then browse to the folder location where the file now exists. Now all I'm going to do here is simply move it back to its original location. So for me, that's the desktop. There is the file. I can select it, click on OK. It's telling me it's going to update all selected tables with the relinked data. That's fine. Let's click on yes. And now we have that new location. So when we click refresh, we should no longer get that error message and we should be able to open NWT customers. Now I'm just going to go away and move this file back to its original location off camera. So join me back here in a couple of moments once I've done that. The final point to mention here is how we can unlink a table. And this is really straightforward. Back into Linked Table Manager, we can select the link and we have a delete option over in the right-hand menu. In this section of the course, we're going to take a look at how we can acquire and install SQL Server Express. And in particular, we're going to look at ODBC and SQL Server in relation to Access 2021. Now, we've already mentioned in previous lessons that Access has historically always been a single file database system that comprises of data and UI components like forms and reports. But as time has gone on, this model has very much needed to change. And we looked at accessing Access tables in one database from a different database. And in Access, you can access data that isn't held in Access databases at all. It's held in other types of database systems. One important example is that Access can use data that is in any ODBC compliant database. And a good example of that, and one that you might be more familiar with, is Microsoft SQL Server. So in this lesson, we're going to take a look and explain a little bit more about open database connectivity. So I'm going to show you how to acquire SQL Server Express, how to download and install it, and how to set up sample data for SQL Server. And then once we've done that, in the next lesson, I'll show you how to access that data using Access 2021. But let's first start out by talking about Open Database Connectivity, ODBC. And this is basically a standard that proves that a database is ODBC compliant, so that the data management aspects are interchangeable with other ODBC compliant database systems. So if we need some customer data for our new customer database, providing it's in an ODBC compliant database, I should be able to access it with no problems. Now, in terms of this course, and from your perspective as a student working through this course, we have a couple of issues. So you might not have access to an ODBC compliant system in order to work through this example. If not, you can install and set up your own ODBC compliant database on your PC. And that's the process that we're going to walk through. Now, it is a reasonably lengthy process, so I will say if you don't have the permissions, maybe you're on your work PC, or maybe you don't have the time to do this, it is still worth working through this lesson because you will still pick up some valuable information. So we're basically going to download and install SQL Server Express. And the first thing to note here, because this might be a deciding factor for you, is that it is completely free. Now, the second problem you might find is that when it comes to installing SQL Server Express, there are many options. You might be installing this on Windows 8, Windows 10, Windows 11. You might have a 64-bit system. You might have a 32-bit system. So the steps that I'm going through are all going to be related to the kind of system that I have. And just for reference, I'm working in Windows 11 and I have a 64-bit system. So what I'm trying to say here is that we can't really do this as if it were a training exercise because there are so many different variables. So it's going to be more of a demo, and if you're going to do this for yourself, the steps you go through and the things you type in might not be exactly the same because it needs to relate to your specific system. Now, if you already have an ODBC compliant database, then most of this section you're not going to need. Maybe you're doing this at work and you already have an ODBC compliant system that you can use. If you do, then you don't need to go through this process of downloading and installing SQL Server. Now, SQL Server is an ODBC compliant system, but there are a number of different editions. So I'm on the SQL Server page on the Microsoft website right now. And as I always say, depending on when you're coming to this course, these website pages change frequently. So if you're coming to this course a little bit in the future, you might find that this page looks slightly different to what it looks like on my screen right now. So you're just going to have to hunt around a little bit and try and find the equivalent pages on the updated website. But as of April 2023, this is what this page looks like on the Microsoft website. Now, if we scroll down on this page, notice at the bottom we have two specialized editions, one for developer and one called Express. And this is the one that we're looking for. We want to download and install SQL Server 2022 Express. As I said, it is a free edition of SQL Server. Now, before we start downloading this, there are a couple of things that we need to make a note of that we're going to need during the setup process. So the first thing we're going to do is jump into Control Panel. Now, once we're in Control Panel, if we click on System and Security, and then System, this is going to open the About page where we can see some information about our specific PC. And you just want to check and make a note of the system type just here. So check if you're using a 64-bit or a 32-bit operating system, because we're going to need this information in the setup phase. So let's close out of these and go back to our download page. I'm going to click on Download Now. And notice at the top, it's downloading this little exe file, SQL 2022 SQL Server Express. And unless you've changed that, that's going to go into your downloads folder. And this is actually a download management tool that will manage the download of the actual software. So I've opened File Explorer, I'm in my downloads folder, there is my download, let's double click to run it. Now the first decision we have to make is the installation type. Now we're just going to stick with the basic installation, so let's select that. We need to read through the license terms, so let's scroll to the bottom and click on Accept. And now we need to choose our install location. Now I'm happy with the default here, it's just going to go into Program Files. You could browse and put this somewhere else, but let's just click on Install. And it's going to go away and download the install package. Now, once the install is complete, you're going to see this screen just here. And there's some really important information that you need to note down. So I recommend just taking a quick photo of this page on your phone or maybe just jotting it down in a notepad, because we're going to need this information in order to install this successfully, because we're going to need this information a little bit later on. And the most important piece of information on this page is the connection string just here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click this icon to the right, which is going to copy that string to the clipboard, and I'm simply going to paste it into a notepad file. So Control V to paste. I'm just going to minimize that down because we're going to come back to it later on. Now, another thing we need to do here is we need to install SSMS. And you can see that button available at the bottom. Now, SSMS is SQL Server Management Studio, and this makes it easier to see, update, and enter data into SQL Server Express. So let's click Install SSMS, and if we scroll down the page a little bit, we'll see a big heading that says Download SSMS, and underneath the link, free download for SQL Server Management Studio. So let's click this link. Again, it's going to download a little exe file. You can see that in the bottom left-hand corner. And this might take a few minutes depending on your system. Once it's finished installing, we can go to our downloads folder. There it is just there. Let's double click to run it. We can choose our install location. Again, I'm just going to go with the default. And then by clicking the install button, we're also agreeing to the terms and conditions. So let's click on install. We'll say, yes, that's fine. And once again, this can take a few minutes to install, so you'll need to be a little bit patient. Maybe go away, get a coffee and come back, and hopefully it should be done. And once it's finished, you should see Setup Complete. So let's click on Close. Now you're going to need to restart your PC in order for this to fully install. So I'm going to go away and do that now. Join me back here once I've done that. Now the last thing we need here is some sample data. And again, this is data that we can download from online. And if you've used earlier versions of SQL Server, then you might be aware of the AdventureWorks database. That was always the sample dataset that everybody used, but it has been replaced in recent years with Wide World Importers. So you can Google for Wide World Importers Sample Database version 1, or you can simply copy the link that I have up here. So again, this might be something that you want to take a quick snapshot of, because this is going to take you straight to the page on github.com that we need. Now the sample data that we want to use is this link just here. So under SQL Server 2016 SP1 or later, there are two links just here. We want this one, Wide World Importers DW Full Backup. So let's click on this, and you can see in the top corner that data is now downloading. So we're pretty much all set up and ready to go now. So join me in the next lesson where we're going to run through how to set up SQL Server. In the previous lesson, we downloaded SQL Express. We also downloaded SSMS and the backup of the sample SQL Server database. So in this lesson, we're going to bring everything together. So we're going to start by restoring the Wide World Importers database from backup into SQL Server. We're going to browse the database in SSMS so we can see what it looks like in SQL Server Management Studio. We're going to create a data source name, or a DSN, and then we're going to use that DSN to make some of the data available in Access 2021. Now we have the Worldwide Importers database, and we're now going to restore that backup as though it were our own into our local instance of SQL Server. And to do that, we're going to use SSMS. But when we run it, and this is a very important point, we need to run it as administrator. So I'm going to search for mine in Windows. Let's click on the Windows logo, and I'm just going to click More just here, because this is what I want to run, SQL Server Management Studio 19. Now, if we right click, you can see we get an option to run as administrator. Now, as I mentioned, I'm using Windows 11. Yours might look slightly different if you're running an older version of Windows. But you should have in the right-click menu a Run as Administrator option. So let's click this, and this is what it should look like if you've opened it successfully. Now on this screen just here, where it says server name, you should find that this corresponds to the information that you took a snapshot of earlier during the install process. So what you'll probably find is that it has your system listed first. For me, that is my laptop, and then we have the instance name. And that is SQL Express 01 for me. And this is the information that you can find in the connection string that we copied to the Notepad file. So if you're not sure, just double check and change accordingly if you need to. Let's click on Connect. So I'm now connected to my instance of SQL Server. And if you take a look on the left-hand side, we can see that we now have this little Object Explorer pane where we have a collection of folders. Now, if we expand databases and then click on each one of these, you can see we don't have a great deal in here underneath system databases, and actually nothing under database snapshots. And what we need to do is we need to attach the Worldwide Importers sample data so that we're able to browse it. So we're going to restore that data from the backup file. So let's right click on databases, and we're going to choose Restore Database. Now at the top here, our source is device, because we have this stored on our PC, and we can then browse for our Worldwide Importers backup file. So depending on where you've saved it, that will depend what you browse to. So let's click on Add, And now we need to browse to the location where we have that backup file stored. Now, I will say if you just downloaded it to your downloads folder, it's going to be quite difficult to find in this file structure. So I'd recommend you move it to something like C drive users, which is where I've put mine, just so it's easier to find. So if we go to C drive and expand users, and I'm just going to click on users, there is my file. So let's select it and click on OK. Let's click OK again, and then OK one more time. And you can see at the top here, it's restoring that entire database. Once it's been restored successfully, we can simply click on OK, and now we can see our database in our Object Explorer. So we can expand it out, we can expand tables, and we can see all of the tables within that database just here. And if you want to take a look at any of these tables, for example, so let's choose this one here, dimension.supplier, what you can do is right click and say select top 1000 rows to preview. So that's going to go away, and we can see in the lower half of the screen the first 1000 rows in that particular table. And what we're actually going to do is we are going to use a bit of the information from this particular table in Access. But for the time being, we can just close the Server Management Studio. So let's click on the cross in the top corner. Now, I just want to talk briefly about DSN, Data Source Name. You need to tell Access about the Wide World Importers database, what it is and where it is, and you need to also tell it that it's an ODBC compliant database. So we need to give it information as to what server it's on, what SQL instance it uses, sort of pretty much that information that we jotted down earlier. But first we need to tell it where to look. And the way to do this is to create a data source name, or a DSN. Now, depending on what operating system you're using, you might do this in a slightly different way. The option that you're looking for is Admin Tools, which you'll find in Control Panel if you're using Windows 10 or Windows 8. If you're using Windows 11 like I am here, you can get to your admin tools through the command prompt. So I'm going to click search, and let's just say run at the top here. And in the bottom, I just need to type in control admin tools. When we click on OK, that is going to take us directly to the area that we need. Notice the path up here. So if you were doing this manually through the control panel, you would go to Control Panel, System and Security, and then we have Windows Tools at the bottom, which is going to take you to the same place. Now what you're seeing here are two files, ODBC data sources 32-bit and the same files but in 64-bit. And earlier, remember I told you to note down which one of these you were using. So for me, that is 64-bit. So this is the one I'm going to use. And again, I need to right click and I need to run as administrator. Now you'll see at the top here we have three types of DSN, so user, system and file. We're going to be creating a file DSN, and this has opened up the folders within documents on my PC. So yours is going to look slightly different to this, but we need to click on add from here. We're going to choose SQL Server and then go into our advanced settings. So here we've got the driver listed out, but if you look above where it says server equals my server, database equals my database, we need to add this information that's relative to us from here. And again, this is information that you should have jotted down earlier on. So for me, I need to type in server equals Deb's laptop / SQL Express 01. And then we need database, and that is the name of our worldwide importers file. So worldwide importers DW. I always like to make sure I have verify this connection ticked. So let's click on OK. And if we're not getting any kind of error after verifying the connection, we can assume that we're fine. So let's click on next. We now need to give our DSN a name. So I'm going to save my DSN into the course files folder. And I'm going to call it worldwide importers _ sample. And let's click on save. Let's choose next, and then we can click finish. So we're pretty much done here. Let's click on OK, and I'm going to close down Control Panel as well. Now let's open up Access again, and we're going to go back to our CRM file that we created earlier on. So now we've gone through this rather lengthy process, we have that connection in place and we have some sample data. We want to access that supplier information from the dimension_supplier table in the Worldwide Importers Sample database. We want to be able to access that from within this database here in Access. So what we can do is jump up to External Data. We can go down to From Other Sources and choose ODBC Database. Now we want to create a link to the data source by creating a linked table. Let's click on OK. And now we can browse for the DSN name. So if you recall, we saved this in the course files folder. So I'm going to quickly browse to that folder. There is wwisample.dsn. So let's select it and click on OK. And now I can see all of the tables in that database. The one that we want is this one just here, dimension.supplier. So let's click on OK. And we can now see that table. Again, we have a little blue arrow next to it because this is a linked table. And if we double click, we can open it up and view that information essentially from an entirely different database outside of Access. And because we've created a link, if anything changes, and because we've created a link, if anybody changes information in that dimension supplier database at Worldwide Importers, it's going to automatically update in our Access database. The final point just to point out is notice that we do have a globe icon next to this table, and that just really denotes that this is an external link to another ODBC database. It's time now to complete exercise 2. And for this exercise, I can't really give you a sample answer as I would need to use a DSN on my system that wouldn't work on yours. So I've just made a copy of my CRM database file. You can see we have A03 in the title bar at the top. And you can see that I have 2 linked tables from the Worldwide Importers database. Dimension_customer and dimension_supplier. So for this exercise, I'd like you to practice creating a new database of your own that just includes those 2 linked tables in your copy of the Worldwide Importers database. So that's basically going to allow you to practice all of the skills that we've learned in the past 2 lessons. So remember, you need to have created the Worldwide Importers database in SQL Server from the backup file, and then you'll need to create your own DSN. And I'd like you to use that DSN to link to those 2 tables. So that's exercise 2. See how you get on with that, and I will see you in the next section. As we've already mentioned a few times already in this course, an Access database by default is a single file. And that can create a number of problems that we're going to review in this lesson. Now, some of these problems that we're going to discuss we can overcome by splitting the database into 2 parts, front-end and back-end. So in this lesson, we're going to explore why we might want to split an Access database. I'm then going to show you the process of splitting a database. We'll take a look at how we can protect the back-end, and then we're going to talk about the importance of the location for the back-end as well. So let's start out with that first question. Why split an Access database? Now, currently, we're looking at the latest version of the Night Movies database. And you'll find this file in the course files folder, and it's basically a copy of the completed exercise 1 file. And if you take a look over on the left, we have all of our objects grouped. So we have our tables at the top, then we have our queries, our forms, our reports, and our macros. Now, it might be that this database is stored in a shared network location, and we might have several users that are going to access the database. Now remember, currently, our database is all in one file. Now, the more people that access this database, the higher the chance is that it's going to be damaged, maybe through some kind of network glitch or some other hardware error that might cause damage to the file. Now, rather helpfully, there isn't really any reason why users shouldn't have their own copy of parts of this database. For example, a user might have their own copy of all of the forms in the database, or maybe all of the queries. Now, of course, we would need to make sure that we have some kind of process in place so that everything is kept up to date. But there is one thing that you can't have your own copy of, and that is the data. The data must always be shared. So in general terms, the UI components don't have to be shared, but the data does. So we could split the database into two parts and put the shared data into the backend and put the non-shared UI components, so things like forms, into the front end. Let's take a look at another reason for splitting a database. Now let's suppose this database is in a network location and we have 10 people using it from different PC locations. When one of those users wants to view or amend data, they load a form. That form has to travel across a network and they load the data for the form. Maybe they change some data or maybe run a report, but everything they do involves network traffic. If you split the database so that the backend is in the shared location and the front end is on the user's PC, only the data part generates network traffic. So as each user is just loading forms on their local device that reside on their local device, you're going to reduce the amount of traffic. Now, another factor that's also very important is security is a lot easier to organize if you have a database that is split into front end and back end. So when it comes to establishing security, the way that you do it for the back end, the data part, is quite different from the way that you do it for the front end. And that links nicely into my next point, which is that if you have users that want to create their own reports or design their own forms, it's much easier to manage if those users have their own front end. So if someone is creating their own forms and reports, rather than putting them into a central location where they might clutter up the database for other users, those custom elements they can keep to themselves in their own copy of the front end database. So with all that said, let's take a look at the process for splitting a database up into front end and back end. And what we're going to do is we're going to create our own new small database to demonstrate this. So we're going to create an asset tracking database. And notice that I'm currently in the new section, so file new, and we're going to use one of Access's templates. And it's this one here, asset tracking. If you don't have it at the top here like I do, you can just search for it down here by typing asset tracking into the search bar. So let's click to open this up. I'm going to give my file a name. Now I'm just going to put mine on the desktop for the time being. I will move this into the course files folder so that you can access this file if you need to. So let's click on create. Now notice as soon as we do that, we get this welcome screen pop up. And we are going to talk a bit more about welcome screens a bit later on. Another thing to note on this welcome screen is that in the bottom corner, you do have a little link here called Get Started, and this will take you into some really useful help files. And I always recommend that you do have a quick look at some of the videos available. Now, for the moment, we're just going to close this welcome screen. And what you'll see at the top here, if we take a look in the navigation pane, you can see that we have 4 tables in this template: assets, contacts, filters, and settings. Now, it's worth pointing out at this stage, if you are going to split a database, you should always take a backup of the database before the split. So in case anything goes wrong, you do have a backup. So I recommend saving off this file in its current state to a different location under a different file name before you start to do this. Now, the next thing you need to make sure is that you have everything closed. So we want to make sure we have all of our tables closed by clicking on the cross. Now, the process for splitting is actually really simple. If we go up to Database Tools, and in the Move Data group, we want to select the Access Database option. And this is going to take us into the Database Splitter. So you can see here it says, this wizard moves tables from your current database to a new backend database. So that sounds like exactly what we want. In multi-user environments, this reduces network traffic and allows continuous front-end development without affecting data or interrupting users. If your database is protected with a password, the new backend database will be created without a password and will be accessible to all users. So an important point just there. And you will need to add a password to the backend database after it is split. It then says it could be a long process. Make sure you make a backup copy of your database before splitting it. So worth reading through these paragraphs. We're going to say split database. I'm going to navigate to the folder where I want these saved. So again, I'm just going to save into the course files folder. And notice the default file name that's been assigned for the backend has had BE added to it. So this is how we can tell that this is the back end part of the database. So I'm happy with that file name. Let's click on split. And there we go. It is done. So now notice something that's changed in the navigation pane. Next to each one of our tables, we now have that little blue arrow because these are now effectively linked tables. They're located in a different file because these are all part of the backend. Now, the location of that backend database is very important because it needs to be in a shared location so that any user that needs access to that data can do so. So in this lesson, I've shared mine into the course files folder in OneDrive, but in a real world scenario, you might want to save that to some kind of network drive or shared location within your team. In the previous lesson, we saw how we can split a database into front end and back end. And currently, we're looking at the front end. Now, there are consequences of this split, which we're going to talk about in this section. So we're going to start out by talking about shared and local tables. We'll then talk about backing up local data, saving in compiled format, moving the backend database, and trusting a database location. Now, currently, there are 4 tables in this database, and they're all now linked tables because we moved them into a backend file. So what we're seeing here is a link to that file. Now, if we double click to open the settings table, notice that this table is a little bit different from some of the others. This table has one single record, and it has 2 fields, ID and show welcome. Now, the purpose of this table is that this is what controls the welcome screen. And this determines if that welcome screen is shown when we open the file. If you recall, when we open up this asset tracking database, we always get that welcome screen pop up. Now it pops up because we have a little tick in this box just here underneath the show welcome column. Now you can also set the welcome screen to pop up in the actual design of your database, but the other option is that each user should have one of these records so each user can choose if they want to see the welcome screen. And we're going to have a look at how this works more a little bit later on. Now at the moment, rather than having this record shared, each user should have their own version of this record and this table. So this table should be local to them, not shared. So currently this sits in the back end, which is shared data. We want to move this to the front end so the user has control. So given that we have this shared table and we need to convert it back to a local table, you'll be pleased to hear that this is a very simple thing to do in Access 2021. What we need to do is just close down settings, right-click on settings from the navigation pane, and right at the bottom we have an option in here, convert to local table. Notice what happens as soon as I do that. We no longer have the little blue arrow next to it because this is no longer a linked table. It no longer resides in the back end. We've moved it to the front end. We might also want to let users set up their own local data. Maybe they're developing their own add-ons, forms, things like that. You can let your users set up their own local tables. And it is completely normal for users to have access to both local and shared data. Now, if users do have local data in their front-end databases, you need to consider this when it comes to backing up data. You need to include the front-end database as well as the back-end. Now, there is a facility in Access whereby we can save a database in compiled format. So if you've just split an Access database, you can save the front end in compiled format. Now, the reason why you might want to do that is that it improves the general performance of the database. It makes it quicker and also smaller because any program code is pre-compiled so it runs quickly. There are also security advantages of doing this. For example, users won't be able to modify the forms in the database. So we can save the database in compiled format and use the ACDE file extension. And in this compiled form, the program code is all in compiled form and can't be edited, but users can, however, create and modify tables and queries. So let's save our database in ACDE format. So we're going to jump up to File, down to Save As, and notice one of the options that we have in here is this one, Make ACCDE. So this file will be compiled to an executable file only. So we're going to choose this one, Save As. I'm going to save it into the Course Files folder again. Check out the file extension, ACDE. Click on Save. So now we've saved that, I'm just going to close down this welcome screen and we're going to close down the file completely. Now if we look at this file in File Explorer and compare it to the original, so you can see here is the ACDE one at the bottom, and then just above we have the ACDB version. If you take a look at the size, you can see that the ACDE file is a lot smaller than the ACDB. Exactly the same file, but the DE file is compiled format. So the database is going to be able to do the same things, but what the users can do will be limited. So let's take a look at that. We're going to double click to open the ACDE version of this file. Now notice here we have the asset list form open. Now if I wanted to switch to the form's design view and make some changes, let's try and do that. I'm going to right click. Notice that we don't have design view in here. It's effectively disabled. Let's close this down and let's try and open something else. So let's take a look at a report. Let's say asset details, for example. If we open this up, we can see the report in report view. If I want to change the design, right click, I don't have that option in here. So you can start to see some of those restrictions when you save your file as an ACDE file. Now there might be other things that you want to restrict. For example, maybe you don't want users to be able to see the navigation pane, for example. You can definitely do that, and it is going to be something that we'll look at later on. Now there might come a point in time where you need to move the backend database. And I would think that this is fairly obvious. That's probably going to cause us problems if the location of that backend database changes. So let's take a look at the type of problems we might get if that scenario occurs. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the course files folder and I'm going to move the backend database. So there is the backend. What I'm going to do is quickly just create a new folder, and I'm just going to call this backend. And let's just very quickly move our backend file into this folder. So let's put it in there. Let's close down this file and let's reopen it. So it's this one just here, tracking 02. Notice we get an error message, could not find the file, and then we have the file path name and that backend database file. If I click on OK just here, we're going to start getting all kinds of error messages, and I won't be able to access anything that's in the backend. So if I try and open some of these backend tables, it's not going to work. So if that does happen, if we have moved the backend and it starts causing problems with our files, we just need to relink to the backend. And we've seen how to do this before in previous lessons. We can use the linked table manager. So let's go up to external data, open up linked table manager. This is our backend file. So let's make sure that we select it. We can choose relink, and then we can go into our subfolder, which is the new location, select it, click on OK, confirm, close this down, and then we should be back to normal, which we are. So that is pretty much how you move a backend database. Now I'm going to go and move it back to its original location, and I will see you in the next lesson. In this lesson, we're going to talk a little bit further about how we can address multi-user issues. And we've referred a number of times in this course to data being shared between different users. And whilst we've been looking at putting in place mechanisms to do this, there are issues that arise when users share data, or what we call the multi-user aspects of sharing data. For example, let's suppose you locate a record in a database and are considering making changes to that record. But at the same time, another user in a different location accesses the same record. So either of us could make a change that has the potential to affect the other person's change. Or, whilst one of us is looking at a record, another person might be changing it so that the data that we're looking at is now out of date. So these multi-use issues are handled in Access using a number of different tools and techniques. So what we're going to look at in this lesson are issues when users share data. We're going to take a look at some advanced client settings. We're going to talk about default record locking, record level locking, and of course we're going to demonstrate record locking. Now, one of the most important things to look at when thinking about this is the balance between the size of the database and the number of users and the level of churn. And when I say churn, that just refers to the amount that the data is changing. So maybe you have a very large database with a large number of users, but the level of churn is low. If that is the case, you can approach the issue of change in a very different way to one where the level of churn is high. Because a database with a low level of churn, you can take the approach that when one user is making a change, everybody else is locked out of that record. Whereas if you have a high level of churn, so lots of users and lots of changes happening all the time, it's going to be frustrating for those users if they are consistently locked out of records that they're trying to update. So in that situation, it's a lot more practical to let other users see a record that is potentially going to be changed. So when you're considering your approach to multi-user access, you need to take these factors into account. Now let's move on to talking about advanced client settings. Now we access our client settings by going into File and into Options, Client Settings, and if we scroll all the way down to the bottom of this window, you can see we have some advanced client settings just here. And you can see that one of the options that we can change is the default open mode. We have two options, shared and exclusive. Now, almost without exception, this will be set to shared by default. Now, there are some situations where you might need to open in exclusive mode. And this is usually due to a maintenance requirement where you need exclusive access. And what we mean by exclusive access is that everybody else is locked out of the database. So if you need to perform some maintenance on a record or a table or something like that, you could set this to open in exclusive mode and you know that you're the only one in there and nobody else is currently trying to make changes to the database. So don't forget about that little option in there. Now I'm going to close down this file and we're just going to open up the A02 version of our CRM database. Because what we can do is we can also open a database in exclusive mode. Now, unfortunately, you can't open in exclusive mode if you're just selecting your file from your recent files list just here. You would need to go into Open and then browse for it in order to be able to see that Open in Exclusive option. So there is the file I want to open, the CRM A02. And if we go to the drop down next to Open, notice we have an option here to Open Exclusive. So if I was to choose this, it's going to open up the database and it's essentially going to lock everybody else out of the database. So it means that I can perform my maintenance task, I can update what I need to update, and I'm not going to have people getting in the way of that. Of course, the downside to this is that anybody else is trying to access the database is currently locked out until I've finished what I'm doing. And if you are working on a database with a high churn rate, so lots of people going in all the time making lots of updates, that can become quite frustrating for your users. So let's take a look at a couple of other options that we have. And for this, we're going to jump back into File, go down into Options, and go back to our Advanced Client Settings section. Now notice here we have a little section called Default Record Locking, and we have three options: No Locks, All Records, and Edited Record. Now the first option means that we do not by default lock a record. So if a user is viewing and changing a record, it doesn't lock anyone else out. Now this sounds a little bit dangerous, but this is the option that is usually used in situations where there is little chance of two or more users changing the same record at the same time. So you might use this option when primarily users are adding data to a database and there aren't really that many situations where the data gets regularly changed and the chances of conflict are small. The next option, All Records, this applies to tables, and when you apply an all record lock, all of the records in the table are locked. So this is sometimes used as kind of a halfway house to do maintenance. So for example, if you need to do maintenance on a table, let's say maybe the records need new fields added, but you don't want to lock people out of the database altogether, you can use All Records. And then the final option here is Edited Record. So this means that when a user selects a record and opens a record to potentially make changes, only that record is locked. So this is a safer way of doing updates, but again, it can be frustrating if the record is left open in a locked status. There's been many situations that I've come across where somebody has opened a record in this mode to make their changes and then has gone off to a meeting and left the record open in locked mode, which means nobody else can access that record. So just be aware of that if you're going to use this option. Now notice underneath we have an option that says open databases by using record level locking. And currently we have a check next to that. So this is really an alternative to locking individual records. But one thing you need to be aware of is that this refers to page level locking. Now the records in a database are accessed using pages of data, and a page can have many records in it. So if you're doing edited record locking and you're asking access to lock individual records, if you uncheck this box, you are actually locking the page that this record is in. So this means you might be locking other records around that record as well. Now the reason why you might do this is due to performance issues. Locking pages is much quicker for access to do. So sometimes switching from record level locking to page level locking can make performance a little bit better. Now whilst we're on this page, let's take a look at some of these numbers that we have underneath that option. You can see that the refresh interval is set to 60 seconds. So this is the interval in which data will be refreshed for you by Access. So if someone has made a change to the data, then that will be refreshed minute by minute. And of course, you can adjust this if you need to. Now let's talk a little bit further about record locking. So I've reopened up the Night Movies database. We're working in the 6.03 version that you'll find in section 6 of the course files folder. And I've just opened the navigation form in Design View. Now, the first thing you'll notice is that this has been split into Frontend and Backend. If you take a look at the tables, you can see that they have that little blue arrow next to them, which tells me that those are linked tables that are possibly stored off in a shared network location, therefore are in the backend, whereas the queries, forms, reports, and macros are all in the front end. Now, if we take a quick look at the property sheet for this particular form, and if we go across to the data tab, notice right at the bottom where it says record locks, it's set to edited record. Now we do have a little drop down here, which is going to give us those three options that we were looking at in Access Options earlier: no locks, all records, and edited record. Now I'm going to keep this on edited record because what this effectively means is that if I had this form, and remember this form is in the front end, if I had this form open on my PC as I do now, and then my colleague down the corridor also opens their navigation form on their PC and tries to edit the same record that I'm currently editing, I'm not going to be able to do that. So for example, if we go back into form view, you can see this is my movie maintenance form. If I was trying to change the year of release here from, let's say, 1994 to 1993, which I realize is wrong, but let's just take that as our example. If I was trying to change this record just here, and somebody else on another PC was also trying to change it, when I try and click away, I'm going to get an error message letting me know that this record is locked. So it's basically not going to let me update or save the record until the other user moves away from that field. So just be aware of that and make sure you fully understand what each of those three options mean when it comes to record locking. It's time now to do exercise 3. So I'd like you to take version 22 of the Night Movies database, which you'll find in the course files folder, and basically turn that into our exercise 3 database. So this is the starting file that you can see on the screen. Currently everything is in one file, but I'd like you to take this and I'd like you to split it into front end and back end. And I'd like the front end to be saved in compiled form. And I'd like to make sure that when you open the front end, you don't get any security warnings. So let's take a look at my version. So you need to start with A022 from the course files folder, but in the exercise files folder, you're basically going to find 4 different versions of exercise 3. You can see that we have front end and back end files for people using a 32-bit system, and front-end and back-end files for people using a 64-bit system. So this is why it's really important to know what type of system you're using and make sure that you refer to the correct files. So I'm using a 64-bit system, and if I open, for example, this file just here, which is the front end, notice I don't get any security warning, and also notice that all of the tables are now showing as link tables because I've moved them to a backend database file. So start with A022 in the course files folder and break it up into front end and back end. And don't forget that you're probably going to need to relink the tables so that everything flows through and that you can access that backend data when you're opening forms on the front end. That's it for exercise 3. I will see you in the next lesson. In this section, we're going to start to talk about macros. And macros are something that you might have used before. They're very popular in many Microsoft applications. You might have used macros in Excel or Word, but they do work a little bit different when it comes to Access. So we're going to start out by going over the basics, and then we'll move on to some more advanced uses of macros. Now, many people don't like the thought of programming, but macros in Access are pretty straightforward once you get into them. And I would say that if you do get a basic grasp of Access macros, the advantages of using them far outweigh the drawbacks. So we're going to start out in this lesson with an introduction to macros. We're going to talk a little bit about macros versus VBA. We're going to take a look at how we can put together a very basic macro, how we can run a macro, and how we can edit a macro. So let's start out by talking about what exactly macros are if you're not familiar with that term. Now, a macro is essentially how we automate a series of repetitive steps. For example, if there is something that you do frequently, maybe a process that you run or steps that you take every week. For example, maybe you run a report every single week. Instead of going through the steps of actually running that report within Access, you could record those steps in a macro and then simply run the macro, which will effectively replay all of those steps automatically and run that report for you. So macros record steps and they help us automate repetitive and tedious tasks. Now, macros are essentially VBA code. Now, if you've used macros in other applications, and I'm going to use the example of Excel, you'll know that you have macros and you have VBA that sit behind those macros. When you record steps and build a macro, you're essentially creating VBA code. And if we know VBA well enough, we don't even have to record the steps and create a macro. We could just simply type out the code and save it as a module in Excel. And that's pretty standard across all of Microsoft Office. But in Access, macros and VBA are very different languages. So it is a little bit different to an application like Excel. And I would say that in Access, macros are a lot easier to use than VBA. So let's start out by taking a look at how we can create a very basic macro. So I'm just working in our CRM database again. You'll find this in the course files folder in section 7. This is 701 that we're working on. And if we go to the Create tab, you'll see that right at the end we have a macros and code group, and one of the options in there is macro. So let's click to open it up. Now immediately you'll see that this looks completely different to creating a macro in Excel. We can select an action over on the left-hand side, and we have a big long list of things to pick from. And then we have an actions catalog over on the right. Now, there is a bit of a tradition in the program world that when you're creating a new macro, you get the macro to output hello world. It's like its introduction into the world. So we're going to stick with that theme, and we're basically going to create a macro that pops up a message box that says hello world. So we're going to click in the Add New Action drop-down box, and one of the options that we have in here is to display a message box. So let's select this, and now we can define our options. So what do we want it to say in the message box? Well, I want it to say hello world. I can then choose if I want it to make a sound when the message box pops up. So do I want to beep, yes or no? I'm going to say no. We then get to define the type of message box this is. So is it critical? Is it a warning? Is it information? So we're going to say that it's a warning, and then we can give the message box a title. So this title will just appear at the top in the title bar of the message box. So I'm just going to say this is important. Now, if I wanted to, at this stage, I could then go in and I could add another action. So we can build up a series of steps or a sequence of steps by simply adding different actions into our macro. And Access will execute these steps depending on what order they're listed out in the macro. So currently the message box is going to pop up first. Now we're just going to keep things super basic first of all. This is all we're going to have in our macro. If I jump up to the macro design ribbon, notice that we have a run button. So theoretically, I can click this to run it, but I need to save my macro first. So I'm going to say, yes, I want to save the macro, and I now need to give my macro a name. So much like everything else, I have a prefix for my macros. So I'm going to say MCR. We'll call this Hello World and click on OK. So it runs the macro. And check out what we have. We have exactly that. We have a message box that says hello world. The type is warning. That's why we have the yellow triangle. And we have this is important in the title bar. If I click on OK, it's going to get rid of that. Let's click the run button again. And there we go. So a very simple and straightforward little macro. Now, another thing to be aware of, if we go over to the navigation pane, notice that currently I'm only showing the tables that we have in this database. So if I click the drop down, let's choose macros, and there is my macro sitting just there. So if I'd close this down, if I wanted to, I could rerun this simply by double clicking on it from the navigation pane, and that macro will run. If I want to edit, if I right click, I need to just jump into design view, click in the message box area, and I can edit any part of that macro. Now, in that example, we need to click the run button in order for this macro to run, or alternatively, double click on it in the navigation pane. But it's important to note that macros can be executed by different actions. For example, we could execute a macro by clicking on a button or hovering our mouse over something. And we're going to look more at that in the next lesson. Just to finish out this little example, let's add another action, and we're just going to add another message box, and we'll say we want the message to say, I hope you are well. We are going to have a beep this time. Let's say we want this to be information, and we want the title to be have a nice day. Now remember, the macro will execute these steps in the order that we see them here. Let's close this down and give it a go. I'm going to say, yes, I want to save changes. If we double click, what we should find is there is our first message box pop-up. As soon as I click on OK, the next step of the macro is going to run, which is to pop up another message box. I heard a little beep, and there we have, I hope you're well. When we click on OK, it exits out of the macro. So that is how you create and run a basic macro in Access. In the next lesson, we're going to talk more about macros, different ways that we can execute them, and also we're going to take a look at the AutoExec macro. In the previous lesson, we saw how we can create a macro to display a Hello World message box. And we talked a little bit about the properties and the usage. In this section, we're going to take a look at the main ways that we can use macros. And we're also going to take a look at a really important macro, and that is the AutoExec macro. So we're going to start out by talking about macros and events. We're going to talk about on-click events. We're going to delve into the AutoExec macro, and we're going to finish out by discussing local settings. Now, when we initially ran the Hello World macro, I showed you a couple of different methods. We can click on the run button, or we can double click on the macro in the navigation pane, and it will run through that macro. So currently, in order for that macro to run, it requires an action from me. I have to click run or double click in the navigation pane. But there are other ways that we can run a macro. And generally speaking, macros will run on the basis of different events occurring. So that might be, as we saw, the click of a run button. It might be someone clicking a button on a form. A macro might run when somebody opens a form, closes a form, or maybe even deletes a record from a table. So each of these is an event, and macros can react and respond to events. So let's demo that. We're going to create a form in the CRM database. We're going to put a button on that form and assign a macro to the button. So we're working on version 4 of the CRM database file. Again, you'll find this in the course files folder. If we jump up to the Create tab and go into Form Design, we're going to get a blank form just here. And all we're going to do nothing fancy. We're just going to add a button control. So if we go up to the controls group, this is the one that we're looking for, button. I'm just going to draw a big old button in the middle, just there. Now, immediately, as soon as I draw that button, I get this little command button wizard. So this kind of gives me options as to what I can do when I click on this button. For example, I might want to go to the next record, or go to the first record, or go to the last record, so on and so forth. Now, I don't want to do any of those things. I want my macro to run when this button is clicked. So for the time being, we're just going to cancel out of here, and we're going to assign our macro to this button. Now, before I do that, I'm just going to change this caption. So let's just say click here, and then I'm going to save my form. So let's say yes to save the changes. I'm going to call this FRM macro test and click on OK. So now I have my form. Let's reopen it and jump into design view. So now we have our button. We need to create our macro. So let's jump up to the create ribbon. We're going to click on macro, and now we can build out what we want it to do when we click on this button. So once again, we're going to go for a message box. The title is going to be "You clicked me." Do I want to beep? Let's say no. The type is going to be, let's go for a warning. And the title, what have you done? Now, if I try and close this macro, again, it's going to ask me to save the macro. So I'm going to say yes, and we're going to call this MCR, you clicked me, and click on OK. And now we can see that that macro has been added on the left-hand side in the navigation pane in the macros group. So now we have the two elements that we need. We have our button on the form, and we've created our macro. So how do we bring these together and assign the macro to the button? Well, if we click on the button, jump up to Form Design and open up the Property Sheet, this is where we can assign this macro to the button. Now, if we go to the Event tab, notice here we have on click, on double click, on mouse down, on mouse up, so on and so forth. So these are different events that could possibly execute our macro. So if I want the macro to run when somebody clicks on the button, this is the option we need, the on click option. Now we have an ellipses right at the end. If we click this, it's going to take us into a little builder just here. We can build a macro, we can build an expression, we can build a code. So I would use this if I hadn't already created my macro. So if I've created the button and I go into here and I think, oh, I haven't actually created the macro to assign to the button, I could click on the ellipses, go into macro builder, and it's going to allow me to build it from here. Now we already have our macro created, so we don't need to go into the builder. Instead, we can simply click the drop down next to on click, and we're going to see any macros that we already have saved listed out here. So I'm going to go for MCR, you clicked me. Let's close down the property sheet. Let's close down the form and say yes to save changes. And now let's reopen this form. So let's give our macro a test. I'm going to hover my mouse and click, and check it out. That macro is running perfectly. And just to show you a bit of a variation on this, if we go back into design view, click on the button again and open up the property sheet, what we could do is we could change this from on click to, let's say, on mouse move. So if I delete the macro from on click and we go down to mouse move and assign it there instead, what you're going to find is that when we close this and save it, the macro is going to execute on mouse move. Now, if I just move my mouse around the form, you can see that nothing is happening. But if I move my mouse over the button, that's when it's going to execute the macro. So if I move, there you go. The macro runs and we get our message box pop up. So just be aware of the different actions that you have. Now, I'm just going to go away and change that back because I don't want that macro to run when I'm moving the mouse around. I want it to run when I click the button. The next thing I want to talk about is the AutoExec macro. Now, many databases have an AutoExec macro, and it's basically a macro that runs when you open that particular database file. And it will run automatically and do various different things, whatever you've set that macro to do. Now, in the asset tracking database that we were looking at earlier, there is an AutoExec macro. So let's open up that file and take a look at it. Now, notice when I open this file, I get that welcome screen pop up. So this is something that is automated when I open this database. And if you take a look over in the navigation pane, if we scroll down to macros, notice that this database has an AutoExec macro. So let's close down the welcome screen. And if I double click on AutoExec, notice the welcome screen pops back up again. So in this particular database file, the AutoExec macro simply runs or shows this welcome screen. Now let's look at this in a bit more detail by going into design view for this particular macro. Now you can see that when we take a closer look at this AutoExec macro, we actually have a few things happening here, not just opening that welcome screen. If we start at the top, the first part of the macro opens the form asset list. So if you've ever opened a database file and you start to notice that the same table or the same form opens every single time you open the database, it's probably going to be set in the AutoExec to do exactly that. So in this case, when we open this file, it's going to display the form asset list. And you can see in the navigation pane, that's this form just here. It's going to open it in form view. We could add a filter. We could add a where condition. The data mode is currently set to empty, but we could change that to add, edit, or read only, depending on how much we want to control what goes on in the asset list. And the window mode is normal. So the first thing this macro does is it opens the asset list form. It will then move on to the next part of the macro where we have this little if statement. And this is what controls if that welcome screen opens or not. So let's read through this. It says if D first, show welcome, settings, then open form, basically. So what does this all mean? Well, if we take a look at D first, and you could jump into the help files if you want a little bit more information about exactly what this means. But briefly, it basically means it's going to look in whatever table we've specified. In this case, that is the second argument, the settings table. And it's going to find the first occurrence of show welcome. So if you have a table that only has one show welcome field, then we can simply use D first. So it's looking in this settings table just here. And if we go into the design view for the settings table, you can see we have a field here, show welcome, which is set to yes or no. So the macro is looking for show welcome in the settings table. And it's basically looking to see if there is a tick in this box or not. So effectively what the macro is saying is if show welcome is ticked, so essentially set to true, if that's the case, then run the following. Open the form name, welcome, in form view. So that's what this little part of the macro is actually doing. And then finally, we have an end if condition just here, which would end the macro if, for example, we don't have a show welcome field or something goes wrong in this part of the macro. So if I were to delete show welcome from settings and then run this macro, this part of the macro isn't going to be able to find the show welcome field in the settings table. If it can't find it, it's just basically going to end. So let's just deselect show welcome in here. Let's close this down. Let's close the macro down. Let's close the asset list down. And this time, if I try to run AutoExec, you can see it's simply going to open the asset list form, but it's not going to show the welcome screen. In this lesson, we're going to continue looking at AutoExec macros. So we're going to start out by going through a few more key points about AutoExec. I'm going to show you how you can trust a project. We're going to talk more about the use of a login dialog. I'm going to show you how to hide the navigation pane. And finally, we're going to talk about bypassing AutoExec. Now, the AutoExec macro that we're going to look at in this particular lesson is the one that we'll find in the Northwind Traders A02 file. So you should already have that saved off to your PC. It was a course file that we used earlier on. Now, when you open up this file, you see that you get this welcome screen with this little login pop-up, and we also get a navigation pane on the left-hand side with lots and lots of different items in it. And the idea behind this login screen is that an employee can come in and they can click the drop-down, they can select their username from the list, and then they can click login. Now, I wouldn't say this is a particularly useful or secure example of a login screen. If we wanted this to work in reality, in a real-world situation, there's lots of changes we'd need to make here. For example, it's probably not the best idea in the world for everybody to be able to see the employees listed down here. And notice that on this login dialog box, we also have a cross in the top corner. So if I want to completely bypass this and just get into my tables, forms and queries, I can simply close this down. Now, in reality, we would not want to have a close option just here. In general, we would need the user to type in their username. That might be their actual name or some kind of username that conforms to company standards. We'd probably also require them to input a password before they can actually log in. So just bear that in mind as we work through this example. Now, I am actually just going to close out of this login dialog because we want to start out by focusing on what we have in the navigation pane on the left-hand side. Now, I'm going to expand supporting objects because if we scroll down, this is where we're going to find the AutoExec macro for this particular database. So let's right-click on it and jump into Design View to take a closer look at exactly what it's doing. So it's going to execute quite a few different steps just here. Now, the first step is to set displayed categories. Now, if we hover our mouse over and take a look at the screen tip, you can see it says it specifies which categories to show in the navigation pane. Now, currently in this navigation pane, I have a lot of stuff in here. And if I click the drop down, I can see all of the different categories. Now, notice currently that I have Northwind Traders ticked and Show All. And if you take a look in the AutoExec macro, you can see that I'm choosing to show, yes, category, Northwind Traders. So that is why this one is ticked. So when I open this file and AutoExec runs, the Northwind Traders category is going to be open. Now, maybe I want to set this up so that created date, modified date, and filter by group are not shown in this categories list. So what I could do is with set displayed categories selected, if I go all the way over to the right hand side where we have the action catalog, I'm going to go into or expand user interface commands. And notice that in here we have a set displayed categories option. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab this and I'm going to drag it so that it's in between the first set displayed categories and if. Let's let go. And now we get another one. So what I can do here is I can say show, no, and then I can choose the category that I don't want to be displayed in that navigation pane. So I'm going to say created date. Let's add one more. Let's grab set display categories, drop it in. We're going to say category, no, and this time we're not going to show the modified date. So let's save. Let's close this file down because what we should find when we reopen this file, we still get the Northwind login, but if we close this down, what we should find is that when we click the drop down, we can no longer see created date or modified date in here. So you can really start to lock down different parts of your database and control what people can access through the navigation pane. Now, I'm just going to go in and reverse what we did there because I do want to be able to see those in this drop down. So join me back here in a couple of moments when I've done that. So let's go back to our AutoExec macro in Northwind Traders and take a look at this second step. So once again, we have an if statement in here. So it's saying if the current project is trusted, then it's basically going to load the startup screen form. And if we take a look in our list of forms, you can see one that we have here is startup screen. If we double click, notice that this is basically an informational message. It doesn't actually do anything. It just shows a piece of information. So it says, welcome to Northwind Traders sample database. In order to use this sample, click options on the message bar and select enable this content. Alternatively, open the database from a trusted location. So what does all of this mean? Well, what this first line up here is basically saying is, notice that we have not in here. So it's basically saying if the current project is not trusted, then pop up that message. So if that is the case, the users will have a yellow warning message running across the top asking them to enable content if they want to continue. So if Access recognizes upon open that this current file is not in a trusted location or isn't a trusted document, it's going to add that warning bar across the top for the user, and it's going to run the startup screen form, which advises users or gives them a bit more information about how they need to proceed. Now, if that's not the case, so if this file is in a trusted location, then it's basically going to skip over this part of the macro and move on to the next part. So this time it says if the current project is trusted, and then we get what it's going to do if it is in a trusted location. If it is trusted, it's going to pop open the login dialog, which is what we see when we open this file because I have this database stored in a trusted location. Anything else, it's going to exit out. That is the end if that we have at the bottom. So that is basically the AutoExec macro and how it works for this Northwind database. Now let's go in and take a closer look at the login dialog box that pops up. So this is a form. There it is just there. Let's open it in design view. Now the first thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to open up the property sheet for this form. And let's click on where it says select employee and we have unbound. Let's click on this and take a look at the event tab. And you can see that this is a combo box style control. And what you can also see is that this is an embedded macro that runs after update. So what that basically means is that the macro has been created directly within this form. It's not a macro that we've created and saved off as an MCR file. And if you recall, I showed you earlier how you can do that by clicking on the ellipses. It will allow you to go in and build your own macro. Now, because we already have one, we're seeing the actual macro code. If you haven't got a macro and you need to build one to embed it in the form, you're going to get that macro builder pop up again. And this macro runs after update because it won't run until the user clicks on the login button. Now, unlike macros that we create separately and we save with an MCR prefix, macros that are embedded within specific forms are not reusable in other parts of the database. So if you do want to have a macro that you can reuse over and over again in different parts of your database, then you really do need to create a separate macro and save it as opposed to embedding it within specific parts of the database. Now, the final thing that I want to talk about here is the navigation pane. Now, for the most part, if we're working on a database, this navigation pane is extremely useful. It's how we navigate to different tables, different queries, different forms, and is something that we'll find ourselves using all the time. But if your users are using this database, you might not necessarily want them to be able to jump into the backend tables and start making changes at will. So one way that we can control what they're seeing is we can disable the navigation pane. And there are a couple of different ways that you can do this. Now, once again, if we go down to the AutoExec macro, let's jump into design view. And if we go over to the action catalog and expand macro commands, we could add this little action just here, run menu command. Let's double click and it's going to add it onto the bottom. Now with these, you can move these around. So I'm just going to move this up to, let's just put it underneath set displayed categories. And what I could do here is I could click the drop down and I could choose window hide. So now if I close down AutoExec and say yes to save changes, let's close down the database and go back in and reopen. Notice what happens. I'm still getting the login, but I'm not seeing the navigation pane. Now, of course, anybody can press the F11 key and immediately it reopens that navigation pane. Now, a little trick that we can use to stop them using that F11 key is to go into File and Options. And if we go to Current Database, we could uncheck this option just here, Use Access Special Keys. So let's deselect that, click on Open. I'm going to close one more time and reopen the same database. I'm not getting the navigation pane, and if I try to press F11, it's not going to open. Now, an alternative way of disabling that navigation pane, if we jump back into Options, and I am just going to toggle this option back on again, but just above where we have Display Form, that's currently set to none because we're not displaying the navigation pane. Now, if we scroll down, notice that underneath Navigation, we have Display Navigation Pane. So I could deselect this box in order to turn that option off as well. And we do have some additional navigation options in here as well. And this is where I can really define what we're seeing in the navigation pane, how things are grouped, how things are ordered. So some really useful additional options in here. Now, the final thing to speak about is how we can completely bypass the AutoExec macro. Now, if we go to File, and I'm going to open my database again, but if we hold down the Shift key as we open, notice that we don't get that login pop-up because it's just completely bypassing AutoExec. So just be aware of that little option as well. In this lesson, we're going to take a look at our macro security settings. So we're going to start out with an overview of code security. We're going to dive into our macro settings, and we're going to talk through trusted documents, trusted locations, and trusted publishers. Now, in principle, in Access, security is very easy. The main areas of risk come from code being run. So really, we should only have code running in our databases that we trust. So for example, if you're given or sent a database from an external source, or maybe you download it from the web, you do need to be a little bit careful of any code that is associated with that database, because sometimes malicious code can be very clever. The file that you open could include some code that deletes records from your database or corrupts your data. So there is the potential of a lot of damage to be caused to your database if you don't fully trust or know the source of the file that you're opening. So what we need to do as diligent access users is restrict the ability of code to run. And we do that from within macro settings. Now you're going to find your macro settings in the backstage area. So if we go up to File and all the way down to Options, this is where you want to be, Trust Center. And we want to dive into our Trust Center settings. Now we have lots of different areas in here. We're going to go to macro settings first of all and just take a look at some of these options that we have. Now the first option here is to disable all macros without notification. So what that basically means is if you are sent a database that contains macros, when you open that database on your computer, it's going to disable all of the macros so they won't run and you won't be able to run them, but you're not going to be told via a notification that those macros have been disabled. The next option is basically the same, but you will receive a notification. So if you've ever seen that yellow warning bar pop up across the top once you've opened something in Access, that is your notification, that is your warning. And in general, this is the option that I like to have mine set to. The next option is to disable all macros except digitally signed macros. Now it might be that the person who has sent you this database has gone through the process of purchasing digital signature software in order to verify that the code contained within the database is fine, but you'll probably find that most people haven't done that. So the option is there, but I would say this is probably the one you're going to utilize least out of all four. And then the final option that we have is to enable all macros. And notice that little warning in brackets there. This is definitely not recommended because potentially dangerous code can just simply run. So if you enable all macros, as soon as you open that file, it's not going to block them. It's just going to run them all. And that is where you might come into a situation where you find you've opened a database that contains malicious code, and all of a sudden, half of your tables have been deleted or records have gone missing. So my recommendation is to use the second option just here. Now, let's take a look at something else. Let's take a look at this trusted documents area. Now, when you open a database in Access and trust it by clicking the Enable Content button at the top, that database basically gets added to your trusted documents list. Now, this is a little bit confusing because you would think that you would be able to see a big long list of all of the databases that you've trusted. But as you can see from this screen just here, you actually can't. But as you do go through trusting databases, once it's trusted and it's on your list, you don't need to trust it again. So you can just open it and you won't get any kind of notification or warning message. Now, a couple of important things to note on this screen. Notice we have a clear button at the bottom. So it says clear all trusted documents, so they're no longer trusted. So if we click this clear button, we don't get a choice as to which ones we're going to clear. It's going to clear the whole list or not at all. So I'm not going to do that, but you could do that if you just want to get rid of them all, or if you know that you have a lot of old databases in there. Another important little option here is this checkbox where it says allow documents on a network to be trusted. So if you're working at a company and you're all on the same internal network and you're sharing databases between you, you can simply check this box to allow all documents on your specific network to be trusted, and then you're not going to get those warning messages pop up. The next page to be aware of is trusted locations, and you can see that I do have quite a few things in here. So what you can do in here is you can basically add locations or folder paths into this area, and any files contained within that folder path are automatically trusted. So I pretty much have all of the locations where I store different files. But if you want to add a new location, you have add new location at the bottom, and then you can browse and add the location that you want to trust. So really straightforward. And of course in here, you can also remove trusted locations or modify any trusted locations as well. And then finally, we have a trusted publishers area. So if you receive databases or files from maybe a particular person or a particular company, you could add those people or that company to your trusted publishers list. And then anytime you receive a file from that particular person or company, it will open without any warning messages. So those are the options that you have when it comes to your macro settings. Have a little look at them, make sure they're set up as you need them to be set up so that you don't run into any issues with regards to malicious code. It's time now to do exercise 4. And there's quite a bit to do in this exercise. Now, your starting point is going to be version 23 of the Night Movies database that you'll find in the course files folder. So take a copy of that. It does have a front end and a back end. And I'd like you to take a copy and create a new version and call it exercise 4. Now remember, when you do this, you're going to need to make sure that the front end links through to the correct back end. So let's open my solution for exercise 4. So this is what I get when I open up exercise 4. Now, in order to complete this exercise, the first thing you're going to need to do is you're going to need to make sure that you have the front end and the back end linked together. And then I'd like you to set this up so that it looks similar to what you can see on my screen. So let's run through a few of the things that I did, and then I'll leave it to you to have a play around. Now notice, as soon as I open this file, I get this little dialog box pop up that says welcome to Night Movies. And we just have a very simple image of a clapperboard on this little pop-up window. So what you're seeing here is a form that I've created and I've customized to suit my needs. So I've added some text, I've added the image, and I've also added a close button at the bottom. Now you should be able to work out how to add all of these elements without too many problems. And when you're doing this, also try and include some of these little additional extras. For example, notice that I have Welcome to Night Movies in the title bar at the top. So you're going to need to create a form, and then you're going to need to set this form so that it opens up as soon as you open this file. So for this, we're going to need a settings table, so we can specify if we want to show the welcome or not. And just as a final clue, if we close this down and go into options, I've also modified a few things underneath here. So think about the form that you want to display once you've closed down the welcome screen. And also think about if you want to display this navigation pane. Now I've left mine to display, but you could practice disabling that as well if you wanted to. Now I have also created an AutoExec macro to automatically open that welcome form as soon as we load up the database. So these are all the things that you need to have a think about. This will give you a really good opportunity to practice many skills that we've learned in this course, and also some of the skills we've learned related to form design in the beginner's course.
If you're not a subscriber, click down below to subscribe so you get notified about similar videos we upload. To get the course exercise files and follow along with this video, click over there. And click over there to watch more videos on YouTube from Simon Says It.